Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, here to guide you today. Many of you use these videos to relax or drift off to sleep, so before we begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Now, settle in, get comfy, and let's begin. Story: unlocked car door leads to almost a decade of aggravated stalking. This is one of the most bizarre and terrifying experiences of my life. It's been years, but a recent event stirred it all up again, and I felt like I had to share it. My story began when I was 18, barely out of high school, and thought I was stepping into adulthood. At the time, I had little to no idea that a single act of carelessness would trigger years of fear, confusion, and psychological trauma. I was raised as a book-smart kid, but sorely lacking in street smarts. I married my first love, Bobby, right at 18. We were both very young, not really ready for the complexities of life, but we jumped in. Bobby and I settled into a rental house just outside of Chicago in a lovely suburban neighborhood. It wasn't a huge house, but it was perfect for two young people starting out, and we were happy. In the basement, we had a large mother-in-law suite where our good friend Nick was staying with us, as he was between jobs. This was around the time I was in nursing school, just starting the rigorous clinical rotation part of the program. I was 21 at the time, and like most nursing students, I had a very early clinical rotation, often starting at the crack of dawn. Being a natural night owl, I needed to maximize every minute of sleep. I started loading my car the night before, books, bags, and even my purse again. My lack of street smarts was evident. I thought it was a smart move, so I didn't have to rush around in the morning, but that decision ended up being a crucial one. One night, before an early clinical shift, I asked Bobby to grab a book from my car. He did, but in the process, he forgot to lock the car door. I woke up to the usual rush of a busy morning, not noticing anything out of the ordinary, until I went to leave for clinicals. When I reached my car, I noticed that my purse was missing. The sense of panic that swept over me was indescribable. I quickly checked the car, and to my horror, the rest of my wallet, my ID, and even my social security card were gone. That's when the gravity of the situation hit me. I filed a police report, more out of fear of identity theft and the financial mess that could come with it than anything else. In the days that followed, strange things began happening. It started small, with little annoyances. We received ding-dong ditch pranks at all hours of the day and night. Then, someone vandalized my car, Nick's and Bobby's, leaving grotesque graffiti, like swastikas and hangman symbols. Our house was egged. It wasn't just harmless pranking anymore. Our things were being destroyed, and it was clear someone had targeted us. Nick's tires were slashed, and the random nature of these events started to become too frequent to ignore. Bobby, ever the optimist, chalked it up to neighborhood kids acting out, but I wasn't so sure anymore. One day, Bobby was mowing the lawn when he noticed piles of cigarette butts outside the bedroom window. This was the point when we decided enough was enough. We called the police, but their response was lackluster at best. They took our report and suggested we install car alarms and bright floodlights for the driveway. Several weeks after the vandalism, the situation escalated in an even more unsettling direction. At 2:30 in the morning, I received a call from a police officer in a neighboring town. He told me they had found my ID on someone named Craig J. He had claimed that I was his girlfriend, and the officer asked if I knew him. I had never heard of him before, and I assured the officer I had no idea who he was. He told me I could pick up my ID at the station in the coming days. At this point, the creeping suspicion that something bigger was going on began to grow, but I still hadn't connected the dots between all of these events. After I got my ID back, strange things started happening on MySpace. This was 2009, so it was still pretty common back then, and Facebook. I began receiving bizarre messages from accounts I didn't recognize. The messages were long and incoherent random ramblings that didn't make sense, but somehow made it clear that the person knew things about me. These accounts seemed fake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were personal in some way. The strange messages soon spread to my friends, and the content became more disturbing as they went on. He started to ask about me, referencing things that only someone close to me would know, like my family dynamics and personal details. I couldn't understand how he knew these things, but I started to feel overwhelmed by the constant flow of messages. The more I blocked accounts, the more he created new ones to contact me through. Things took an even darker turn when I started receiving emails from this same person. At first, I dismissed them, thinking it was just an obsessive prank, but the emails kept coming, and they were no longer just incoherent ramblings. He spoke to me like we were long-lost friends, as if we shared some connection. The longer the messages got, the more unnerving they became. Despite his words not being overtly threatening, they were unsettling enough to make me uncomfortable. Something wasn't right, and I began to fear that whoever this person was, they were watching me. One evening, while my friend Lauren and I were sitting on the couch watching TV, the house suddenly felt different. It was hard to pinpoint, but something seemed off. Our husbands, along with a few other friends, were out for the night, and the two of us were alone. Then, we heard a noise coming from the attached garage. It sounded like someone was shaking the garage door. I went to check, but there was nothing visible. At first, I assumed it might be an animal, as we had had occasional issues with raccoons. But the noises continued, moving from the garage to the kitchen window. Lauren's face turned pale as she looked at me, clearly frightened. I could feel my heartbeat quicken. She whispered, "Do you hear that?" The sound of someone knocking or scratching at the window was unmistakable. We froze, unsure of what to do. We tried calling our husbands, but they didn't answer. At this point, we didn't know whether to call the police or wait it out. I hesitated, because I didn't want to make a scene over something that could be an animal. Then Lauren's expression changed. She looked past me in terror, and I turned just in time to see the handle of the front door wiggling as if someone was trying to get in. We both jumped up at once. Lauren grabbed a knife from the butcher block, and I grabbed a small hammer from the junk drawer. We rushed to the back of the house and locked ourselves in one of the bedrooms, our phones in hand as we dialed the police. The dispatcher instructed us to stay on the line and move furniture in front of the door. We pushed a dresser against the door, gripping our makeshift weapons, ready to defend ourselves if necessary. The police arrived a few minutes later, their sirens blaring. We watched from the bedroom window as the red and blue lights flashed in the driveway. The officers checked the house, but found no signs of anyone entering or attempting to break in. They took a report, and we were left feeling shaken but relieved. Our husbands called us back, and after the police left, we discussed what had happened, though none of us could come to a concrete conclusion about what had really transpired. A few months later, things took another disturbing turn. Our close friend Sean needed a place to stay while he renovated his apartment, so Bobby and I offered him the third bedroom in our house. The first night Sean stayed with us, at around 2 a.m., we were awakened by a blood-curdling scream. Sean was yelling at someone, and Bobby and I rushed into the hall, only to find Sean and his girlfriend wide-eyed and terrified. The window screen had been slashed, and Sean told us that he had woken up to the sound of something or someone scraping at the screen. We called the police again, and the officers dusted the window for fingerprints. The prints matched none other than Craig J. At this point, everything started to fall into place. Craig had been in my high school, a year below me, but I didn't know him well. He was a quiet, odd kid who had dropped out before graduation. My friends and I couldn't recall any significant interactions with him. But suddenly, this stranger was a looming threat. He had been stalking me for years without me realizing. When the police arrested Craig, he had an outlandish story. He claimed that we were secret lovers and that I had been ignoring him. He even went so far as to say that I had let him into my house many times. This was absolutely absurd. I had never invited him into my home, let alone have any kind of relationship with him. I was floored by the audacity of his lies. Craig was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering. His sentence was like just a few months in jail and a fine. Afterward, I filed for a restraining order against him, hoping that this would finally end the nightmare. At first, things seemed to calm down. Craig served his time, and for a while, I thought I was free from him. But the anxiety and fear didn't really leave me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. In 2010, I was 23 years old, and I had moved to a new apartment after divorcing Bobby. I thought that a fresh start in a new place would be the change I needed. I settled into a 4-unit building with a locked entrance and a key required for access. I lived on the 2nd floor. I had graduated and was working as a nurse at a local nursing home, feeling like things were finally falling into place. But little did I know that Craig's obsession with me was far from over. In the spring and summer of 2011, the strange incidents began again. It started with phone calls coming through to my workplace. When I answered, no one would speak, just a dead line. Then, letters started showing up in my work mailbox, sent with no return address. These letters were strange, just like the emails from before, rambling, disjointed, and speaking to me as though we had a deep connection. It was clear that this person still thought we had some bond, but their obsession had only grown more intense over time. They were relentless, sending multiple messages a week, as though trying to force a relationship that never existed. The emails didn't contain direct threats, but they were unsettling. The person wrote as though we were old friends, speaking to me in a familiar tone, yet the language was strange and obsessive. There were long paragraphs, with no real point, just strange statements about how we were meant to be together. I felt trapped again, unable to escape his grasp. I began to dread checking my inbox, wondering if there would be another cryptic message waiting for me. Despite these disturbing events, the police couldn't do much. I had no concrete evidence that any crime had been committed, only an ongoing, uncomfortable harassment. I couldn't get a restraining order for this particular behavior because there were no threats or physical actions to warrant legal intervention. I started to feel frustrated, like I was shouting into the void, trying to protect myself while no one could stop him. One night, in the summer of 2011, I woke up suddenly to the sound of the doorbell ringing. My heart immediately started racing. I looked out the window and, through the floodlight, saw Craig standing there. My body froze in panic. This wasn't just a random occurrence, it was happening again. I couldn't breathe as I ran across the hall and banged on my neighbor's door. My neighbor, an older man who lived alone, immediately went downstairs and confronted Craig. I could hear their conversation, but I didn't dare go down. I quickly called the police, explaining the situation as best as I could. Craig tried to deny anything was wrong, but he eventually fled when my neighbor threatened to call the cops. This wasn't the end, though. Craig's behavior became even more brazen. He started messaging my friends on Facebook, asking about me and telling them he had important information to pass along to me. Other times, he would alternate his messages between saying I owed him money and demanding that I pay a debt. He was trying to manipulate those around me into helping him communicate with me, as if they were pawns in his game. And then, things got even worse. One day, my younger sister, who was living in the city, called me in a panic. Craig had somehow found out where she lived and drove to her apartment. He confronted her while she had friends over. Naturally, she was terrified and kicked him out, immediately calling the police. But once again, the authorities had little to act on. Craig hadn't physically harmed anyone, and his behavior was still just on the edge of being legal. So the police offered her a restraining order, but nothing more. But this wasn't the only time Craig's obsession extended beyond me. One afternoon, my cousin, who was a senior in high school and on the cross-country team, was at practice when Craig showed up uninvited. My cousin had no idea who Craig was, but Craig started demanding information about me. When the coach intervened, Craig became belligerent and started a fight with him. The cops were called, and Craig was banned from school grounds. But once again, there was no significant legal action taken. The real breaking point came when Craig escalated things to my workplace. He somehow tracked down my nursing home's administrator's phone number and called him, asking him to pass along a message to me. The administrator, who had already been made aware of the situation, was firm with Craig, telling him not to come onto the property again, or he would be arrested for trespassing. At this point, I was living in a constant state of paranoia. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling like someone was watching me. The worst part was, he wasn't even trying to physically confront me anymore. He was using manipulation, harassment, and deceit to get to me through everyone around me. It felt like I couldn't escape. My once secure life had been turned upside down. Then, just as quickly as it started, it seemed to fade away. The calls and messages stopped. The visits to my workplace ceased. Craig vanished from my life, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. But I was wrong to think that the nightmare was over. By 2012, things seemed to have quieted down, and I thought perhaps it was finally over. I was almost 25 years old, and I had started rebuilding my life. I had moved into a new apartment with my friend Stacy, who had recently broken up with her boyfriend. She was staying with me temporarily while she looked for a new place. We had a small, 2-bedroom apartment in a fairly quiet part of town. The apartment building had only 4 units, and the front entrance was locked, requiring a key to get in. I felt safer here than I had in years. Stacy and I had a pretty normal routine. She was dating a new guy, and they would spend several nights a week together, so I usually had the place to myself. Life was starting to feel like it was settling down, and the events with Craig seemed like a distant nightmare. I thought that perhaps, with time, I would be able to move past everything that had happened. One day, I worked a long double shift at the nursing home, starting at 7 a.m. and not finishing until almost midnight. Stacy had texted me around 3:30 p.m., saying she wouldn't be home that night because she was going out with her boyfriend. I thought nothing of it and figured she would just leave a light on for me, as she often did. When I finally returned home around midnight, I walked up to the door and immediately noticed that something was off. The door was unlocked. At first, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Stacy must have forgotten to lock the door when she left, but deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. As I stood in the hallway, the silence in the apartment felt suffocating. I had learned over the years to be hyper-vigilant, locking doors, checking windows, and never letting my guard down. I had never left a door unlocked, especially after everything that had happened. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to go inside cautiously. The apartment was dark. Not a single light was on. I had always kept at least 1 or 2 lights on when I wasn't home, so this struck me as unusual. My heart started to race. I knew that something was wrong. I moved through the apartment slowly, checking each room. I glanced into the kitchen and living room, but nothing seemed out of place. I was still uneasy, though, as though something was lurking in the shadows. As I made my way to the kitchen, the feeling of dread intensified. Everything was still, yet the air felt thick with tension. I had this overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I quickly moved down the stairs and knocked on my neighbor's door. He was a Puerto Rican man who lived on the first floor and often had parties on the weekends. I didn't want to alarm him, but I had to let him know something wasn't right. He gave me a concerned look when I explained what had happened. At first, he seemed skeptical but agreed to come upstairs with me to check it out. We walked up the stairs to my apartment, and when we got inside, he began looking around. I was still unsure whether I was just overreacting to the stress I had endured over the years. Maybe Stacy had left in a hurry and simply forgotten to lock the door. But my instincts were screaming at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started to feel more and more like I was imagining things, but as we moved into the kitchen, my neighbor walked over to the pantry door. In one swift motion, he pulled it open. What we saw next made my blood run cold. There, crouched inside the pantry, was Craig. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My neighbor quickly reacted, putting Craig into a chokehold and pulling him out of the pantry. I immediately called the police, trying to hold myself together. As I spoke with the dispatcher, my mind was racing. What did he want? What had he planned to do? I couldn't understand how he had gotten inside, especially with the locked entrance and the fact that I was almost never home alone. The police arrived shortly afterward and took Craig into custody. I still don't know exactly how he managed to get into my apartment, but my theory is that Stacy, who was not accustomed to locking doors as securely as I was, had left the door unlocked without thinking. When I confronted her about it, she denied it, but I couldn't help but wonder if it was an oversight that allowed Craig to sneak back into my life. Craig was arrested and charged with breaking and entering, aggravated stalking, and trespassing. He was convicted and sentenced to time in prison, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even though he was behind bars, the psychological toll of the years of harassment didn't disappear overnight. In the years that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I moved into another apartment and started a new chapter, but the fear and paranoia still lingered. I was never truly comfortable in my own space, and I found myself double-checking locks and keeping furniture against doors, as if my mind couldn't fully let go of the trauma. Fast forward to 2016. By this time, I was 29 and married to someone else. I thought I had put everything behind me, but one day, I received a Facebook friend request from Craig. My heart sank. I didn't know how he found me, but I immediately blocked him and made it clear that any contact from him would result in the police being called. It was the last straw. I couldn't believe that after all these years, he still had the audacity to contact me. Then, in a disturbing twist, Craig found my new husband on Facebook and sent him a friend request. My husband, who had no idea about the history, accepted the request out of curiosity. As soon as he saw the messages from Craig, he immediately blocked him. I was horrified when I found out, but I was also relieved that my husband was as protective and vigilant as I had become. Despite blocking Craig from every possible avenue of communication, the fear he instilled in me didn't just disappear. It resurfaced in unexpected ways. There were moments when I would hear a strange noise outside my window or feel an inexplicable sense of dread. My anxiety increased when I had to go anywhere alone, and I became hyper-vigilant about my surroundings. Even now, I still check the locks and constantly question if something is lurking just outside my door. I know this is not a healthy way to live, but the fear and trauma that Craig's obsession caused have left deep scars. It's something I'll never truly shake off, even though I've tried to move on. The most lasting effect of this whole ordeal was the psychological toll. I developed an irrational fear of first-floor windows, and to this day, I find myself checking the locks obsessively, convinced that if I slip up, someone could come barging in again. The terror of not knowing what Craig intended, or what would have happened if I hadn't been lucky enough to have a neighbor who stepped in, still haunts me. There's also the issue of my identity theft. Craig had stolen my purse, and in doing so, had gotten access to my social security number. He either lost it, gave it away, or sold it, but I later found out that someone had used my social security number to apply for Medicaid benefits in Arizona. They even managed to obtain a job using my details and failed to pay taxes. This caused a mess with the IRS, and I had to go through months of financial headaches before they finally unfroze my accounts and refunded the money they had taken out of my paychecks. Even today, my credit is still recovering from the damage caused by his actions, and I now keep a close eye on my accounts and have put a permanent lock on my social security number. It's frustrating that my life was completely upended by one moment of carelessness. The moral of the story is simple. Always lock your doors, never leave your purse in your car, and never take your safety for granted. You never know what small action could lead to years of trauma. I learned this the hard way, and it's something I'll never forget. Story: creepy guy at the bus station. I've been working on getting my learner's permit, something I neglected for a long time due to various circumstances. For now, I take the bus and train, or rides if a place isn't in walking distance. I don't mind a good walk, but I try not to push it too far. That's not really the point, though. Let me explain. To get to work, I used to take the train to a bus station because that path was quicker and less crowded. I don't work there anymore, and only a couple of weeks after I left, the place got shut down, which didn't surprise me given what I had witnessed happening there. But at this bus station, there was one guy who always took the same bus as me. At first, I didn't pay him much attention, though I kept my wits about me. As a woman, you learn to be cautious, especially in a bus station that often sees druggies and homeless people. They usually sleep in the waiting hut, trying to stay warm and accessing things like the bus map. This guy noticed me, but initially it didn't seem like a big deal. He just stared, not doing much else. However, over time, he kept showing up whenever I arrived, and I started feeling uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, assuming he just needed the bus to get to his own destination. But he didn't just stare passively, he started mimicking my movements while I waited. I have a tendency to pace when I wait for the bus, and I had little changes in my routine, like turning different ways or pacing a certain way. He started copying these little quirks. It felt weird, like he was studying me. One day, I noticed him standing closer to me than before, and suddenly he began doing workout stretches, like he was preparing for some kind of exercise. I moved away from him, trying to ignore the strange behavior. The unsettling thing was that he kept appearing at the bus stop every morning, and no matter how I tried to avoid him, he would always be there. Sometimes I took different buses or walked instead, but there he was, on the same bus I used most often, always seeming to appear at the bus stop when I did. My work schedule shifted a few times, and I was relieved to go a few days without seeing him. When my hours changed, I wouldn't see him for a day or two, but eventually, he would be back, doing the same thing, and I felt a growing sense of unease. I've never been one to speak up easily, because of past experiences with how I was treated by a parent growing up. Plus, he hadn't done anything overtly threatening, aside from trying to get my attention and show up at the same time as me. But my gut told me to stay alert, and I always remained wary of him. When I lost my job, I didn't need to go to that bus station anymore, and I didn't see him for a long time, which was a huge relief. I'd had enough of men following me, creeping around bus stops or stations. This happened to me a second time when another guy followed me on the bus for a while, even getting on the same bus a few times. I panicked, knowing he was following me. Luckily, he disappeared after I told my boyfriend about it, but that was a different guy, and I never saw him again. But the situation with this creepy guy didn't end there. One day, I decided to go to the mall, which was along the same route I used to take to work. I hadn't been there much recently, as I was trying to save money. But on this particular day, I decided to go since I was bored, and it's my favorite mall. It has lots of cool places, shops, and things to do. I got off the train around noon, a time I hadn't usually been at the bus stop before, since I would typically take the bus between 7 to 8 a.m. To my shock, there he was, at the bus stop again. This time, it was much later in the day, and he was still there, pacing and clearly looking at me. I tried to ignore him, but it was hard. He kept throwing obvious glances in my direction, making me uncomfortable. There was a girl waiting at the same stop, and she noticed him looking at me. She kept glancing between us, as though she could tell I was uneasy, but she didn't say anything. She just kept an eye on him while I moved to keep out of his line of sight. When the bus finally arrived, we all got on, and I made sure to pick a seat away from him. The girl seemed to go about her day, though she glanced at me again as I sat down. The guy moved to a different spot, but he sat right behind me, even though there were plenty of open seats elsewhere. I noticed him leaning forward slightly, and that made my skin crawl. I got up and moved to another seat further away from him. The girl glanced at me again but didn't comment. I was relieved that he didn't follow me, but he kept looking my way, then away, and then sneaking another glance. When I got off the bus, he moved toward the bus stop I usually took to get to work. I headed to the mall, hoping he wouldn't follow me there. I didn't take that route again for a while, mostly because I didn't need to go that way anymore. I've had enough of these uncomfortable encounters, especially since I'm pregnant now. I didn't want to risk feeling uncomfortable or even motion sick by taking a crowded bus. The last time I went to the mall, I was babysitting a child and went for food and something fun to do. Luckily, I didn't see the creepy guy that time. Whoever you are, creepy dude, please let's not meet again. I don't want you in my life. Story: creepy cultist neighbors from Salt Lake City. This story is about something that happened to my family when I was a little girl, back in the mid to late 1980s. After my father retired from the Marine Corps in the late 1970s, he began working for a defense contracting company based in Salt Lake City. My family consisted of my mom, my older sister, and me. From an early age, my sister and I were raised Catholic, and I remember attending Mass regularly once I could read and write. Utah, as many people know, is the home of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormons. I apologize in advance to any Mormon readers if I get some of the terminology wrong. I've read a few church publications out of curiosity, but that was many years ago. Growing up in Utah, my sister and I attended the same elementary school while both our parents worked during the day. I was a quiet, shy child, but I always enjoyed spending time outside. Our neighbors, a family with many children, lived next door to us. They didn't attend our school, and I later learned that large families are quite common among Mormons, particularly in Utah. Our houses were separated by a wooden fence with gaps here and there, and I distinctly remember how easy it was to get splinters from the rough edges. Sometimes, the kids to boys and a girl my age would climb over the fence to play with my sister and me. They never stayed too long, but we had a lot of fun together. Every time they came over, however, I would hear their mother yelling for them to come home. At first, I didn't think much of it. My own mother would call me inside too. But it seemed to happen every single time they came to play. One day, after they had joined us in our yard and we had a snack of apple slices and cheese, the mother shouted for them to return home. I went inside shortly after, and we ate dinner as a family. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud banging on our door. My dad got up to answer it, telling my mom to keep me and my sister at the table. It turned out that the man at our door was the father of the family next door. He was furious because, unbeknownst to us, his children were on a restricted diet, and he was upset that we had fed them without consulting him first. I don't recall the details of the conversation, but I do remember hearing my dad, who stood 6'7" and was a former Marine, cursing repeatedly before slamming the door shut. That was the only time I saw this man. After that, the kids stopped coming over to play. We still waved to each other through the fence, but they no longer came into our yard. Every time they were near the fence, one of the women, often the same middle-aged woman, would shout at them to go inside. Sometimes, it seemed like a different woman was yelling at them. I didn't understand why this was happening, and when I told my parents about our fence meetings, I could tell they were concerned. Over time, the kids' appearances began to change. They started dressing in more modest clothes, button-up shirts, blue jeans, and the girls exclusively wore dresses. I thought they were super grounded or in trouble for something, and that was why they couldn't play with us anymore. But every time they came near the fence, the woman would yell for them to leave, and they would run off, looking terrified. I felt sorry for them and told my mom how sad it made me. Looking back now, I realized there was nothing I or my family could have done. Eventually, I saw the girl my age one last time. She told me that her family was moving to a ranch in Arizona, and they probably wouldn't be back. I offered her a friendship bracelet I had made, but when I mentioned it, a look of dread crossed her face, and she refused to take it. At that moment, to older women, one large and almost gorilla-like, the other thinner with blonde hair, shouted at her to come inside immediately. After that, I never saw the family again. My parents seemed strangely relieved. About a year later, my mom began asking us unusual questions. She wanted to know if we had ever been inside their house, or if they had ever invited us to their church services. I was 8 or 9 at the time and didn't like going to church, so I couldn't imagine wanting to go to another one. My mom's persistence worried my dad, and one night, when the questions became too much, my dad took her aside and said something like, if they knew anything, Don't you think they would have told someone or us by now? They were just little girls. They didn't know anything. After the stock market crashes in 1989, we left Utah for good. I didn't think much about the neighbors until the YFZ ranch raid in 2008. I suddenly remembered everything, and I called my parents to talk about it. They're much older now and don't remember everything as clearly as they once did. After some reflection and light research into the history of fundamentalist Mormon sects, I'm fairly certain that our neighbors were followers of Warren Jeffs. It's clear now that their children were being raised in a highly controlled, isolated environment, likely to prevent them from having any exposure to the outside world. At the time, though, I didn't have the understanding or the knowledge to make sense of it. In 2011, my mom sent me an email with some shocking news. She had been talking to some of our old Utah friends, and she told me that a girl who had used to play with us had committed suicide. She had been trying to escape from her husband for some time, but my mom refused to go into any further details. Even now, my mom won't explain why she left him. To the creepy cultist neighbors from Salt Lake City, let's never meet again. Your impact on my childhood is something I'll never forget. The bells of the forgotten village. I still remember the chill that ran through me. It was late afternoon, and I had spent the entire day alone in the cramped basement, trying to turn the old storage space into a workshop. The flickering overhead bulb cast uneven light as I stripped away rotten panels and scraped layers of peeling paint. Sweat trickled down my face. My hands were caked with dust, and my clothes carried the heavy odor of damp earth and mold. In a corner beneath a protruding beam, I noticed a narrow crack running through the old concrete wall. At first, it seemed harmless, just a slender fault in the rough surface, but when I ran my fingers over it, a sudden, impossibly cold breeze hit me sharp, like air escaping a freezer. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Curious and uneasy, I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the concrete. That's when I heard a muffled, low voice murmuring my name. I jerked back, heart racing. The voice was deliberate, drawing out each syllable as if savoring them. I turned off my tools and listened, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The only other sounds were the soft hum of the furnace and faint traffic through the small basement window. But the voice came again, softer now, as if retreating into the wall, whispering secrets only I would know, details about my past, moments I hadn't shared with anyone. Sweat trickled down my neck, and I felt my mouth go dry. I rationalized that it must be a trick of the acoustics or old pipes carrying echoes from elsewhere in the house. This place had always felt odd since I inherited it from my reclusive aunt, who I barely knew. The basement had a history, rumored to have been a shelter, but I never cared to investigate further. The voice didn't stop. It hinted at things to come, future events, like an approaching storm or an unexpected midnight visitor. Sometimes, it mimicked my voice so perfectly that I couldn't tell if the words were coming from my own mind. Terrified, I fled upstairs, gulping down water in the kitchen as I tried to calm my racing heart. Determined to end this, I decided to seal the crack. Armed with filler and tools, I returned to the basement, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was stifling, and the space felt unnervingly tight. Kneeling by the crack, I shone my flashlight inside and caught a faint glimmer of sheen deep within the fissure that resembled polished metal or wet stone. I pressed filler into the gap, determined to lock away whatever lay behind it. Instantly, the voice rose in protest, louder now, mocking me in my own tone, repeating my private thoughts and self-doubts. My hands trembled as a sudden icy gust blew through the crack, cutting through my shirt and leaving me gasping. Panicked, I abandoned the task, leaving the job unfinished. That night, I dreamed of faceless figures moving silently through my hallway. Their smooth, egg-like heads were featureless, and they hovered near my bed, reaching out with long, jointless fingers. I woke up in a cold sweat, unable to shake the oppressive feeling that the crack and the voice within it held something far more sinister than I could comprehend. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest tight, and the clock read 3 a.m. I could still feel phantom fingertips brushing against my skin. Unable to sleep, I paced the living room until dawn, thoughts of the voice from the crack consuming me. The house's oppressive silence weighed on me, and I realized I hadn't felt at ease since starting work in the basement. The next day, I tried another approach. I dragged an old shelf to block the crack, hoping out of sight meant out of mind. But as soon as it was covered, I felt a heavy pressure at the base of my skull. The voice returned, muffled yet relentless, revealing unsettling details about people I once knew and moments I regretted. It also foretold eerie events, tools rusting, a burst pipe upstairs, and a letter bearing bad news. Its tone was steady and unnervingly confident. I tried to distract myself with chores, repairing stairs, checking the fuse box, clearing cobwebs, but the voice seeped into my thoughts. Sometimes it was so subtle I mistook it for my own internal monologue. Other times it sang my name mockingly, echoing through my mind. While cleaning, I stumbled upon an old ledger. Inside were shaky notes from my late aunt about a sealed door in the basement wall, left by the previous owner. One cryptic line chilled me. "It's not trying to kill, it's trying to become." I slammed the book shut, heart racing. That evening, I reached out to a friend, hoping to confide, but my calls wouldn't go through. Even texting failed, leaving me alone with my spiraling fears. When I glimpsed myself in the hallway mirror, I thought, for a fleeting moment, my reflection's lips moved while mine did not. The sight nearly sent me screaming. Determined to confront the source, I returned to the basement with a flashlight and hammer, widening the crack enough to peer inside. My beam reflected off a smooth, warped surface deep in the cavity, like an ancient, tarnished mirror. I saw the faint outline of my own eye staring back, distorted and unnatural. The voice grew louder, whispering my name as the temperature dropped. It wasn't violent, but invasive, threading itself into my thoughts. Panicking, I hammered a wooden board over the crack. The voice wailed, reverberating not in the air but in my skull. My fingers went numb, and icy air clawed at my throat. I faced a decision: leave this house, my last refuge, or confront the force behind the wall. I chose to fight. I spent the night sealing the crack completely, using cement, metal mesh, and paint. The voice fought back, hissing my failures and past mistakes in cruel detail, but I pushed on. By morning, it was gone, only a faint line remained beneath fresh paint. The basement felt warmer, quieter. Exhausted, I slumped onto a stool, hoping it was over. For a week, everything seemed normal. The voice had faded into a faint murmur, almost like a trick of memory. I avoided the basement, but couldn't shake the sense of a lingering chill. My dreams were still haunted by faceless figures, but they felt distant, like echoes fading into the background. I allowed myself to believe the ordeal was behind me. Then, yesterday, the unease returned. While checking for moisture in the basement, I noticed something in a shiny patch of the floor where a puddle had dried. My reflection stared back, but its lips moved, parting slowly while mine stayed shut. Its head tilted slightly, and behind its shoulder, I glimpsed the faint outline of a featureless, watchful face. The temperature plummeted. My heart thundered as I stumbled back, unable to tear my eyes away until I caught myself against the railing. The reflection's lips moved again, silently forming my name. Now I sit here, trembling, the door locked behind me. The pressure in my head hums like a distant whisper. Dust coats my tongue, and every reflective surface feels like a trap. I've covered the bathroom mirror with a towel, terrified of what I might see. I can feel its presence within me, not fully formed but growing stronger, waiting in the shadows of my thoughts. I've closed the crack in the wall, but I can't shake the feeling that I've merely given it a new place to dwell. When I stand in front of the kitchen window at dusk, I sometimes catch my reflection grinning at twisted, out-of-sync expression or silently mouthing words I can't quite hear. In the stillness that follows, there's always a faint murmur, just below the edge of perception, calling my name. It's a constant reminder that, no matter what I've done, this nightmare isn't truly over. I can't say how long I've been wandering in this cursed mist, but it's far too long. My throat is raw from the cold, damp air, and my skin feels clammy under my jacket. When I left the trail just a few hours ago or so, I think the forest was quiet and serene. I'd planned a simple weekend hike, reach the summit, enjoy the view, and return before sunset. Now, nothing looks familiar. Even the trees seem distorted, their shapes warped by the swirling white haze. The mist is everywhere, thicker than I've ever seen. It moves lazily, without a breeze, and carries a faint, stale odor, like air trapped in an old chest. The smell churns my stomach, and my nostrils flare at the unpleasant tang. My eyes sting, and if I stand still for too long, a strange dizziness overtakes me, as though the ground beneath me is tilting. I swear it feels like walking on an unstable platform. I try to focus on a nearby tree trunk, each step sinking into damp leaves and soil. My heart pounds, weighed down by a persistent sense of dread. Something is wrong, very wrong. I pull out my compass again. The needle spins aimlessly, refusing to settle. My GPS, fully charged when I started, won't even turn on now. It's as if the mist has drained the life from everything electronic. Frustrated, I shake the device, muttering curses under my breath, but it's useless. Reaching the tree, I lean against it, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Through the fog, I see something, a faint outline of a figure, no more than a dozen feet away. I freeze, my heart hammering. I don't call out. Instead, I watch. The shape is tall and thin, hunched slightly forward, its edges shimmering and breaking apart as the mist consumes it. Then it's gone. I blink, unsure if I truly saw anything. It's not the first time. Human-like forms seem to emerge and dissolve in the fog, as if the mist itself is painting and erasing them at will. They vanish before I can confirm they're real. My legs tremble, but I push forward, desperate for the mist to clear. Instead, I find a small cabin, old and weathered, with gray planks and a sagging roof. It doesn't belong here, it wasn't on any map. Still, it's the only shelter I've seen. I step inside, the creaky door groaning under my weight. The light filtering through grimy windows is dim, and the air smells of mold and rot. My boots scrape across warped floorboards, stirring the stale scent. A chair lies toppled, and a table leans awkwardly against the wall. I lean against the cabin's interior, my breath uneven, fingertips numb. The space offers an odd sense of comfort, but something about it feels deeply unsettling. I set down my backpack and check my supplies, water, some food enough to last the night if I'm careful. Wiping the sweat from my forehead, I try to focus. Just this morning, I was full of optimism, ready to escape the noise of the city and enjoy the mountains. Now, I regret every step that brought me here. My attention falls on a mirror nailed to the far wall. Its chipped frame surrounds a dusty, murky surface. As I approach, I can't make out my face, only a shadowy silhouette. Raising a shaky hand, I wipe the glass with my sleeve. The reflection sharpens just enough for me to see something pale drifting behind me, outside the window. I whirl around, nothing. When I look back, my own frightened expression stares out from the mirror, the dim cabin surrounding me. On a shelf, I find papers curled, faded, and weathered. They appear to be journal entries or notes. Phrases jump out at me: fog, impossible readings. Compass spinning, voices at night. My stomach sinks. Someone else was trapped here, but there's no sign of how they escaped or if they ever did. The handwriting becomes frantic, the letters slanted and smudged. No dates, no name, just scattered observations and complaints. Then I hear a low hum outside, soft yet insistent. It's not the wind. There's no rustling leaves or moving branches. The sound swells, rhythmic and steady, more like voices in a distant chant. Pressing my ear to the door, I hear the hum rise and fall, as though beckoning me back into the mist. My skin prickles at the thought. The strange shapes I've seen haven't attacked me, but they linger, just out of reach. It's as if they want me to wander, to lose myself entirely. I sit on the floor, knees drawn to my chest, trying to calm my breathing. I need a plan. With my compass and GPS useless, I'll follow the slope of the land downhill that should lead to the foothills where my rental cabin and car are waiting. I still have energy bars, a whistle, and my flashlight. For now, it works. But the mist feels alive, patient, and I know it's waiting for me to make a mistake. I click the flashlight back on, its beam slicing through the dim cabin. It lands on the mirror again. For a split second, I see movement within, like someone passing behind me. My heart leaps as I swing the light around wildly, but there's nothing, just broken furniture and old wood. The cabin feels oppressive, its walls closing in on me. My breathing is shallow. I grab my bag and bolt outside. The mist wraps around me immediately, damp and suffocating. The humming voices are quieter now, but persistent, distant yet constant. I pick a direction downhill and move cautiously. The undergrowth grabs at my ankles, and I slip on wet leaves, catching myself on low branches. My heart pounds in my chest, and I feel like the forest is alive, watching. To my right, a tall, featureless shape materializes, impossibly still. I shine the flashlight on it, and it vanishes, melting into the fog. I stagger backward, nearly dropping the light. The chanting grows louder again, surrounding me, its source impossible to pinpoint. My vision blurs, nausea rising as the mist clings to my face and eyelashes. My body alternates between sweating and shivering. My ears pop, and I shake my head to clear the dizziness. Still, I press on, each step deliberate, though I feel like I'm sinking. After stumbling over a fallen log, I decide to rest. My muscles ache, my limbs heavy. Tilting my head upward offers no comfort. There's no sky, only endless whiteness. Then I turn around somewhere, the chanting fades to silence, leaving me feeling like I'm adrift in a void. I bite my lip until I taste blood, using the pain to stay grounded. Desperate, I rummage in my bag for my whistle and blow it twice. The sharp sound cuts through the air, but is swallowed quickly by the fog, returning as a weak echo. No reply. I close my eyes, trying to remember the map. The rental cabin where I began was only 2 hours from the main road, and I know the trail was well marked. If I can find the river, I should be able to navigate back. But my compass spins aimlessly, and my GPS remains lifeless. Suddenly, footsteps echo behind me. I leap to my feet, heart racing, flashlight trembling in my grip. I whip it around, illuminating nothing but swirling mist. Still, I feel it's something ancient, passing by, unseen. The hair on my neck stands on end, and I think about the journal pages in the cabin. They spoke of voices, distorted readings, and impossible phenomena. What if this fog isn't natural? What if it's something old, something that's always been here, luring travelers off the path to wander endlessly? It doesn't kill, it traps you in panic and confusion until you're lost forever. The thought chills me, but I refuse to give in. I grit my teeth and force myself to move. The ground slopes slightly downward, so I follow the incline, repeating under my breath, "Keep moving, keep moving." My voice cracks. Shapes continue to appear in the corners of my vision, human-like figures that vanish when I try to focus on them. I stop looking directly, knowing they want me to panic, to lose my way entirely. The flashlight dims, and my throat tightens as I quicken my pace. The mist presses closer, heavy on my eyes, until I remember the mirror in the cabin. The reflection, the vague figure standing behind me. What if it wasn't just outside? What if it's inside me now? A sharp pain shoots through my chest, and I gasp, stumbling forward. The chanting returns, louder, a haunting choir calling my name. They want me to listen, to stop, and turn back toward the heart of the fog. My teeth chatter, and I scream, "Leave me alone." The words feel hollow, muffled by the mist. The chanting fractures into whispers, echoing in my own mind. My palms sweat, and I swat at the air, nearly dropping my bag. I keep moving, though I'm sure I've been walking in circles. The cabin could be behind me, or ahead, or gone entirely. Time blurs as I press on, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. Then, I see it, a faint thinning in the mist, just ahead. It's subtle, but the air seems lighter, clearer. Desperation fuels me as I lurch toward the break, pushing through branches that claw at my coat. My breathing is ragged, my legs unsteady. The whiteness lifts slightly, revealing a slope I think I recognize. A glimmer of hope flares. This could be near where I started. The rock formations look familiar, though I can't be certain. Checking my compass again, I notice the needle still spins, but slower now. I try my phone. It beeps faintly, no signal, but it's not completely dead. I exhale, trembling, trying to steady myself. The chanting fades behind me, but it doesn't vanish. I can still feel it on the back of my neck, a lingering presence. They're not gone, they're just letting me believe I'm safe. After another 10 minutes of trudging through the mist, I spot a fallen pine I'd passed early that morning. Relief floods through me. I'm finally nearing the edge. My head still pounds, but the dizziness eases, and I quicken my pace, heading in what I hope is the right direction. Behind me, I hear something faint, like the echo of my whistle, as if someone else is blowing it. I refuse to look back. When I finally break free of the densest part of the mist, I collapse near a large boulder. The world feels different. There's color again. The green of moss and brown earth seem vivid after the oppressive whiteness. Though tendrils of fog still linger at the edges of my vision, I want to both laugh and cry. My body aches, my clothes are soaked in sweat, and my breaths come in ragged gasps. I check my phone's screen. The battery icon flickers to life, weak but present. My compass wobbles, as if trying to reorient itself. I'm not safe yet, but I'm closer. As I stand and take a few cautious steps forward, I glance at my watch. The reflective glass catches my eye. For an instant, I see my pale, haunted face and something else. At the corner of the reflection, a faint outline shifts among the trees. My heart stops, and I jerk my arm away, breathing hard. When I look again, the shape is gone, but the unease remains. I know it's still there, clinging to me. Even out of the mist, its presence lingers, lurking in reflections and shadows. As I limp downhill, I glance over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting the whispers to start again. Though I've escaped the worst of the mist, its touch feels permanent. A stain deep inside me. I know I'll never trust my compass the same way again. I know I'll always fear mirrors, watching for flickers of movement in their depths. The mist doesn't kill. It doesn't have to. It only needs you to remember it, to carry its presence with you. And I will. I'll never forget. I had come to the hotel alone. There would be no one to help me when morning came. The footsteps outside my room ceased for the moment, and I hurried downstairs to confront the receptionist. "Is there anyone else on my floor?" I demanded. He gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile. "No, sir, you have the entire floor to yourself." That afternoon, I removed the chair from beneath the doorknob and opened the door abruptly, hoping to catch someone in the act. The hallway was empty. Frustrated, I tried recording the sounds with my phone, but all it captured was faint creaking. I wandered the corridor, running my fingers along the dusty frames of the antique mirrors. Stopping before the largest mirror near the staircase, I stared at my reflection. My pale face and bloodshot eyes stared back, hair damp with sweat. Something flickered at the edge of my vision, a shape drifting behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple, or perhaps it was my nerves playing tricks. By the third night, my exhaustion was palpable. The pacing outside my door resumed, followed by the doorknob turning softly at first, then more insistently. I barricaded the door with my luggage, but I could still hear scraping noises and faint whispers. Pressing my ear to the wood, I caught a sound like slow, raspy breathing. I retreated to the bed, shaking uncontrollably. Shadows seemed to thicken, spreading across the walls like ink. The air turned stale, heavy with a scent like old, forgotten places. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched pressed down on me. And then the footsteps began inside the room, circling my bed. I reached for the lamp, but it wouldn't turn on. Something heavy pressed on my shoulders, holding me in place. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. Yet on the far wall, a shadow stretched unnaturally tall, its head tilting just as in the old photograph I'd found earlier. Desperate, I whispered, "Leave me alone," my voice breaking. There was no response, only silence waited with an unnatural patience, as if the presence was waiting for me to break. Near dawn, delirious and sleep-deprived, I tore through the dresser drawers and found an old letterhead from the hotel's early days. Written in careful cursive was a guest's note: "I cannot leave this room. He walks the halls every night, and when I look in the mirror, I see him behind me." My stomach churned. This had happened before decades ago. The realization struck me. It didn't want to kill me. It wanted me trapped in fear, night after night, endlessly reliving the terror. In a final act of defiance, I ripped the sheet from the covered mirror in the corridor and stared into it. My reflection stared back, but not alone. Behind me, a tall, distorted silhouette leaned forward, its elongated fingers hovering near my shoulder. I blinked, and the hallway was empty again, but I knew it was there. Always waiting, I stumbled back into my room, slamming the door and bracing against it. When morning light finally seeped in, I felt drained, as though I had spent the entire night running. Determined to leave, I packed quickly, ignoring the tingling sensation at the back of my neck. As I reached the door, the knob resisted, groaning as I pulled it open. The hallway stood silent and still. Dragging my suitcase, I made my way to the elevator. In the old mirror beside the doors, I saw my haggard reflection. I looked like a man broken by sleepless nights of terror, but as I adjusted my collar in the glass, I froze. My reflection's eyes were darker, its posture slightly off. Behind it, a familiar tall outline lingered at the edge of sight. My stomach dropped. With a ding, the elevator arrived. Before stepping in, I glanced back at the mirror. My reflection smiled faintly, an expression I hadn't made. My legs faltered, nearly toppling my suitcase. As the doors closed behind me, I could still hear it, the steady pacing footsteps echoing faintly in my ears. They followed me, unwilling to let me go. I left the building soon after, but even as I walked away, an odd tension lingered in my muscles. My shoulders felt stiff, as though they carried a weight I couldn't shrug off. Passing a storefront, I glanced at my reflection in the glass and froze. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow behind me, impossibly tall and looming. When I looked again, it was gone. Yet now, I can never be sure. Maybe I carried that presence with me, locked inside my own fearful mind. Maybe I will always feel the subtle pressure of a turning doorknob, hear the faint pacing of unseen footsteps, and catch the distorted shape in every reflection, waiting to be noticed once more. It's funny how a quiet day can flip on you just when you think you've got things under control. Something slaps you right across the face. It was 2007, a time when nothing much ever happened in Stanton. Population just shy of 2,500, and I think half of those were cattle. Anyway, name's Wyatt Fletcher, local sheriff for the past 8 years. Not a bad job if you're into traffic stops, breaking up bar brawls, and helping old ladies figure out how to reset their TV remotes. Real edge-of-your-seat stuff, right? My wife used to joke that I'd end up writing parking tickets for life. She wasn't wrong. Stanton's no crime capital. It's mostly fields, barns, and to streets where every business closes by 6 p.m. unless you're talking about Miller's Diner, which stays open until 10 on a good night. The kind of place where you can leave your car unlocked and not worry. That's what I thought. Anyway, the day started like any other. I just finished filling out a report on someone's missing chickens and honest-to-God farm animal theft complaint when dispatch buzzed about a call. Around here, weird noises usually means a raccoon in the trash or a kid messing around. But this wasn't one of those calls. "Wyatt, you better check out the old Granger place," Helen from dispatch said. "Caller says there's something in the barn. Says it doesn't sound normal." "Define normal," I asked, half smirking as I grabbed my keys. Helen didn't laugh. "Just get there, Wyatt." The Granger farm had been abandoned for over a decade. The land was nothing but overgrown weeds and rusting machinery. Folks around here said the place was haunted, but folks around here also said the creek water gave you warts. Most of the talk was just that talk. When I pulled up the long gravel drive, I noticed something odd right away. The barn doors were cracked open, just enough to make you feel like something might be watching from the shadows inside. I grabbed my flashlight and started toward it. There was no sign of the caller, and frankly, I figured I'd be chasing off some kids who dared each other to camp out there for the night. The smell hit me first. You don't expect certain things when you've been in law enforcement for a while, but smells are something else. This wasn't just bad, it was wrong. Like something had been rotting for a good while, hidden deep in the corners of that barn. I stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with dust and decay. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, and that's when I saw it. Dead animals. Not just chickens or stray dogs, but larger ones. Sheep, a cow, even a deer. All of them torn apart in ways that weren't natural. Not cleanly, either. It was like something had ripped them open without a care in the world. A chill ran through me, and not because of the cold. I've seen enough dead things to know when it's an animal attack. This wasn't that. This was different. I heard something move in the shadows. Not a scuffle or the rustle you'd expect from an animal trying to hide. No, it was deliberate, a heavy drag, like something too big for its own body scraping across the floor. The rotten stench thickened, clinging to the back of my throat, and the hairs on my neck stood up like they sensed something my brain couldn't process yet. "Who's there?" I called out, my hand instinctively drawing my gun. That's when I saw it, or part of it. The beam of my flashlight caught a mass of matted black fur, hunched low over something in the corner. It was large, larger than any bear or wild animal I'd ever seen in these parts. But it wasn't just the size. It was the way it moved, the deliberate stop when the light hit it, as though it was thinking. The damn thing was thinking. I stepped back, my heart racing. Slowly, it lifted its head, and in that split second, I knew this wasn't a bear. No animal stares at you like it's calculating whether you're worth the effort. It snarled, or something close to a snarl, to low, to deep, like air forcing its way out of a hollow chest. I fired, not out of bravery, but fear. The shot echoed through the barn, but all I managed to do was piss it off. It lunged, impossibly fast for something so massive. I barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as it swiped past me, scattering old crates like they were toys. My brain finally caught up with my legs, and I ran full tilt out into the open. Outside, I could still hear it crashing around inside, slamming into walls and letting out furious, guttural noises. But it didn't follow me. I don't know why, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. "Helen," I yelled into my radio, "I need backup. Something's not right out here." "What do you mean, Wyatt?" Her voice crackled back, calm and skeptical. "I don't know what it is, but there's a thing in the barn that's killing livestock, and it could be dangerous." "Wyatt," she replied slowly, "are you sure it's not just some wild animal?" "It's not a damn animal." I shouted, cutting her off. There was a long pause. I could almost hear her trying to decide if I'd finally lost it. "Maybe I had. I'll send Hank your way," she said at last. "He'll be there in 20 minutes felt like a lifetime." I paced near my cruiser, gun still in hand, half expecting the thing to come tearing through the barn doors. But it didn't. When Hank arrived, he took one look at me, sweaty, pale, and still shaking, and raised an eyebrow. "Wyatt, you okay? What the hell's going on?" "You need to see this," I muttered, motioning toward the barn. We walked back together, Hank leading this time. I wasn't about to face that thing again without someone else to see it for themselves. The smell hit him first, and I saw the unease creep into his expression. But when we stepped inside, we both froze. It was gone. The animal carcasses were still there, scattered like trophies, but whatever had been in the barn had disappeared. There was no trail, no blood, no sign that it had dragged itself out. "Jesus," Hank muttered, glancing around. "What the hell did this?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but it's not here now. We filed the report as an animal attack. What else could we do? People don't believe in monsters." Hell, I didn't either, not until that day. I spent the rest of the week on edge, waiting for anything to turn up. But nothing did. No sightings, no bodies, no more dead animals. It was like the whole thing had been wiped clean, but I knew better. I knew the day was going to be rough when the donut shop ran out of glaze. That's the kind of omen that makes you wonder if you should just call it quits early. But no, I still had a job to do. Been at it for 12 years here in Craven Springs, West Virginia. Name's Billy Garber, small-town cop, born and raised. Craven ain't big, but it's home. You know, the type small enough that everyone's in your business. And if you don't wave to Mrs. Hill at the corner store, your mama will hear about it by lunch. Not much happens here except the occasional drunk at the mine or a bar fight at Rosie's. Lately, though, it had been too quiet. So when the call came in about something going down in the woods off Pike Hollow Road, I didn't hesitate. Figured it was just some kids messing around. By the time I got out there, the sky was a dull gray, like it couldn't decide whether to rain or just stay miserable. Pike Hollow Road wasn't much more than a dirt path cutting into dense forest, the kind of place you only go if you're hunting or hiding. Dispatch hadn't said much, just strange noises, which usually meant a spooked raccoon or a coyote. I parked my cruiser at the trailhead and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The woods were unusually quiet. No birds, no whine, just stillness. All right, let's see what you kids are up to, I muttered, heading into the trees. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't kids playing a prank. About 100 yards in, I found a boot. Not a sneaker, a real hiking boot. Heavy duty, great, lost hiker, I muttered. But when I picked it up, it was still warm. The unease hit me like a punch. A smear of blood on a nearby tree confirmed that this wasn't just a lost hiker. I parked my cruiser at the trailhead, stepped out, and gave a quick look around. The woods were dense here, thick with pine and underbrush that didn't see much sun. Quiet, too, in a way that didn't sit right. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. All right, let's see what you kids are up to, I muttered, grabbing my flashlight and heading into the woods. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't some teenagers playing a prank. There was something off, not just the quiet, but something deeper. About 100 yards in, I found a boot. Not a kid's sneaker, a real hiking boot, heavy duty and meant for rough terrain. Great, lost hiker, I said, shaking my head. But when I picked it up, it was still warm. I kept walking, now more alert, the kind of alert that gnaws at the back of your mind, telling you something's out of place, but you can't quite put your finger on it. A few minutes later, I spotted something else, a smear of something dark on the trunk of a tree. Blood. Suddenly, the woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. I wasn't armed. Yeah, I know, a cop without a gun. But in Craven Springs, you don't usually need one. The last time I used mine was to scare off a coyote messing with some cattle. My service pistol and bulletproof vest were back at the station, locked up, because I hadn't thought I'd need them for a simple call about noises in the woods. Big mistake. The deeper I went, the worse it got. I found more blood, not splatters, but streaks like someone had been dragged. The trail led further into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the light barely made it through the canopy. That's when I heard it. A sound that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. A low, gurgling grunt, like something choking on its own breath. All right, Billy, I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. Just figure out what it is, call it in, and get out. No need to be a hero. I pushed through the underbrush, my flashlight flickering in and out, casting weird shadows that made the trees look like they were closing in on me. Then I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. At first, I thought it was a large deer or maybe a bear. But no, this thing was wrong. It had the size of a grizzly, but its limbs were too long, too gangly, like a spider with skin stretched tight over bones. The head was misshapen, like someone had taken a wolf and smashed its face in. But the worst part was its mouth, a gaping hole lined with sharp, jagged teeth. Nothing about it was natural. It was dragging something, someone, a body. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move, not with this thing standing there, gnawing on the mangled body like it was a chew toy. It hadn't seen me yet. Thank God. I slowly backed up, praying the crunch of dead leaves underfoot wouldn't give me away. That's when it looked up. For a split second, we locked. Not eyes, I didn't see eyes. Whatever it had, it knew I was there and it didn't like being watched. I turned and ran. I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. My heart pounded in my ears, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster than I ever thought possible. But I knew I wasn't going to make it. This thing was faster, stronger, and hungry. I made a split-second decision. I couldn't outrun it, but maybe I could outsmart it. Veering off the trail, I dove into a patch of thick brush and crouched down, holding my breath. The noise stopped. I sat there in the silence, my chest heaving, adrenaline surging through my veins. For a moment, I thought I'd lost it. Then I heard its slow, deliberate footsteps. It was searching for me, hunting me. I had to get back to the cruiser, back to something metal and solid. The radio. I could call for backup. I just needed to move without it hearing me. Crawling through the underbrush, I realized the sound of its footsteps was growing distant. Maybe it was giving up, or maybe it had found another victim. Either way, I didn't care. All that mattered was getting out alive. After what felt like an eternity, I finally made it back to the trail. The cruiser was still a ways off. I was about to make a break for it when I heard a scream. Not human, not animal, something in pain. Against every instinct I had, I stopped. I looked back. What the hell are you doing? I muttered to myself, just run. But something made me freeze again. Maybe it was the thought that if I ran, I'd lead it back to town and someone else would get killed. Or maybe it was the fact that I'm a cop and it's my job to protect people. I don't know, but I turned back. The thing was standing over a body, thrashing like it was wounded, its chest heaving with each breath. There was another man not dead, but barely clinging to life sprawled out at the creature's feet. He had a hunting rifle slung across his back, and I realized in a flash what must have happened. He'd shot it. He'd actually wounded the thing. I didn't think. I just acted. Rushing toward the man, I grabbed the rifle off him and, without even aiming, fired a shot straight into the creature's chest. It screamed a high-pitched wail mixed with the gurgling of blood. It stumbled backward, collapsing into a heap of limbs and fur. It wasn't dead, but it wasn't getting up anytime soon. I dropped the rifle, shaking, and bent down to check on the man. He was barely conscious, bleeding from deep gashes across his torso. "You all right?" I asked, even though it was obvious he wasn't. He coughed, blood dribbling down his chin. "That thing," he managed to rasp before his eyes rolled back in his head. I looked at the creature, still twitching on the ground, its breath shallow. Whatever it was dying, and I was glad for it. We never did find out what that thing was. The doctors patched the guy up, but he didn't make it through the night. Didn't matter, though his story died with him. And the thing? Well, it didn't exactly vanish, but it didn't stick around for long either. They carted it off to some lab upstate for testing, whatever that means. But I'm still here, back in Craven Springs doing my job. Small-town life doesn't change, not really. People still wave when they pass by, Mrs. Hill still gossips at the corner store, and kids still find stupid ways to get themselves into trouble. But me, I don't go near those woods anymore. I leave that to the next guy. My luck ran out the minute I stepped out of that coffee shop on Main Street. The brisk wind that blew down the empty street didn't belong in mid-May, and it made me glance at my watch like it could explain the sudden chill. It was 1997, Somerset County, Pennsylvania, mid-afternoon, and I was supposed to meet my partner to go over some reports. My name's C. Porter, and I'd been on the force here for 9 years. In all that time, I'd believed Somerset was the kind of place where nothing happened. Petty crimes, drunk brawls outside dive bars, the occasional wandering stray, that was the extent of it. It was the type of town where you could set your watch by the monotony. Quiet, predictable, and frankly boring. At least, that's what I thought before that day. I wasn't a kid with big dreams growing up. I didn't imagine myself solving homicides in the big city or chasing criminals in high-speed pursuits. I just wanted to get by, to stay out of trouble. My dad used to say my smart mouth would get me nowhere, and maybe he was right. But what he didn't understand was that being sharp and sarcastic wasn't a flaw, it was survival in a place like Somerset. Being a cop wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills and gave me something to focus on, something to stop me from thinking about why I never left this town. The truth was, I stayed because there was nowhere else to go. I was on my way to the station, rolling my eyes at the thought of another dull shift when the call came through. The radio crackled to life, breaking through the hum of my cruiser's engine. Dispatch to all units. Missing hiker reported near the old quarry. Last seen around the backwoods trails. Calls like this weren't unusual. People wandered off trails all the time, got turned around, and needed someone to hold their hand back to civilization. Usually, it ended with a lecture and a promise to stay on the path next time. But this call felt different. The old quarry wasn't a place anyone went willingly. It had been fenced off for years after a string of accidents. The terrain was treacherous, all sharp drop-offs and unstable ground. You'd have to be either clueless or reckless to wander in there. By the time I pulled up to the trailhead, the bad feeling in my gut had settled in. There was something off about this place that day. The woods loomed dark and heavy, the trees leaning toward each other as if whispering secrets. Frank, my partner, was already there, map in hand and a frown on his face. He was a solid guy, the type who could eat his weight in donuts and still outpace everyone else in a foot race. But today, even Frank looked uneasy. "Cal," he said, not bothering with a greeting, "this doesn't sit right. Kid's been missing for over a day, no sign of him. His family says he doesn't know a compass from a can opener, and there's no reason for him to be out here." We decided to split up. Frank took the perimeter while I headed deeper into the woods. The further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no whine, just the crunch of leaves under my boots and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. That's when I found it. A pile of clothes, shredded and scattered, like someone had been yanked out of them. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just fabric hanging from the branches like a warning. I crouched down, examining the ground around the clothes, trying to make sense of it. "Frank," I said into my radio, keeping my voice steady. "I found something, looks like static." Then, faint and broken, Frank's voice came through. "Cal, you've got to. It's not." The radio went dead. I stood, my heart pounding. Frank didn't scare easily, and the fear in his voice was enough to set my nerves on edge. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness as I made my way toward where he'd been searching. The trees seemed to press closer the deeper I went, their branches intertwining overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast. The air was too still, too heavy. Every step felt louder than it should, the sound of leaves crunching beneath my boots echoing in the unnatural silence. "Frank," I called, my voice swallowed by the stillness. Nothing. I kept moving, my pulse racing with every step. This wasn't my first missing persons case, but it was the first time I felt like I might end up as one myself. When I reached the clearing, I knew something was wrong. Frank wasn't there, but something else was. A body, or what was left of one, lay in the center of the clearing. It was mangled, torn apart in ways I couldn't comprehend. Blood soaked the ground, pooling around scattered pieces of flesh and bone. I didn't need to be an expert to know this wasn't the work of any human or any animal I'd ever seen. The air grew colder. I could feel it watching me. Whatever had done this was still out there, hidden in the shifting shadows of the trees. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, the beam trembling as I moved. The shadows seemed to breathe, shifting in ways they shouldn't, and then I saw it. I could recognize it had the posture of a dog, but the bulk of something far larger. Its skin stretched tight over muscle and bone, and its face, no, its head was wrong. The teeth were jagged and mismatched, like a shark's, jutting out at odd angles. But the worst part wasn't how it looked, it was the sound it made. Not a growl or roar, but a wet, raspy rattle like air struggling to scrape in and out of its lungs. I took a step back, and it moved fast, too fast. I barely had time to draw my sidearm before it was on me. The impact slammed into my chest, knocking the wind out of me, and sending me sprawling onto the ground. My gun flew from my hand, disappearing into the underbrush as I scrambled to my knees. The pain hit next. Claws ripped into my shoulder, searing and hot like a blade carving through me. I tried to kick it off, but the thing was relentless. Somewhere in the chaos, I heard a woman's voice, sharp and commanding. Then came the crack of a gunshot. The creature let out a guttural scream, not a growl, but something raw and primal, and it recoiled, darting back into the darkness of the trees. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was the pain or the blood loss that made everything tilt. When I finally managed to pull myself up to my knees, I saw her. She was standing there, rifle in hand, dressed in torn camouflage. Her face was hard, determined, and she kept her eyes trained on the tree line, like she expected the thing to charge back at any second. "Get up," she barked, yanking me to my feet. "We need to move. Now." I didn't argue. She half dragged me through the forest, her rifle never lowering as we stumbled forward. I didn't bother asking who she was or how she'd known to show up. There'd be time for questions later if we lived. After what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the woods and into the clearing near my patrol car. I collapsed against the hood, clutching my shoulder as blood seeped through my shirt. The woman scanned the edge of the trees, her rifle still steady. What the hell was that thing?" I gasped. She didn't look at me. "You don't want to know," she said, her voice flat and final. There was something in her tone, something heavy, like she'd seen this before, like she knew exactly what it was capable of. I wanted to press her for answers, but exhaustion hit me like a wave, dragging me under before I could say anything else. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. My shoulder was wrapped in bandages, and the pain had dulled to a distant throb thanks to whatever meds they'd given me. Frank was dead. They never found his body, but I didn't need them to. I knew what had happened. That thing had taken him, just like it tried to take me. I left the force a week later. It wasn't because I was scared, and it wasn't because I was traumatized. No, it was something else. I realized that nothing I could do, no amount of training or patrolling, could keep Somerset safe. The woods weren't safe, and no amount of policing was going to change that. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the trees. And the worst part, I had a feeling it wasn't the only one. Story: childhood nightmares in Texas. I've always been a small girl standing at 4 feet 11 inches full grown, and I've always been able to pass as much younger than my actual age, especially when I'm not wearing makeup. When I was a small child, around 7 or 8 years old, my dad bought a little cabin in a small town in Texas called Livingston. Specifically, the area was called Onalaska, which I mention for a reason, especially because of the second part of this story. Anyone with kids should be cautious about this place. The cabin itself wasn't anything special, just a small 600 square foot structure, essentially a single room with a tiny kitchen the size of a normal bathroom, a closet-sized bathroom, and a small porch out front. The whole property was spread across 2 lots, so we had plenty of space, but the cabin itself was modest. It was situated in this odd area that felt like a strange mix of both rural and suburban living, true neighborhood vibes, but not the pristine, cookie-cutter suburban environment I was used to in Houston. Despite how odd the area was, I ended up growing quite attached to that cabin. Some of my most cherished childhood memories are tied to it, including the story of evacuating Houston during Hurricane Rita, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, around the time I was 11 or 12 years old, my father bought me a 4-wheeler, and the whole little lake town suddenly became so much bigger. I didn't go super far, but it was exciting to explore more of the area than I had before. It was pretty common to see me zipping up and down the road with a bunch of neighborhood kids riding along with me as we headed up to the lake house for weekend visits. This was around 2001-2002, so cell phones existed, but they were still not as widespread as today. Most people didn't have them yet. I had a pager, but no phones at the lake house. So my dad gave me a walkie-talkie with a pretty long range. Looking back, I realized this might have been a bad idea in hindsight, but at the time, It felt fine. We spent so much time there, and it felt like a safe little town. One of those weekends, I was buzzing around the neighborhood like usual when I stopped at a peninsula overlooking the lake. It was a spot where we kids often came to swim, despite the very real threat of alligators lurking nearby. But being the naive kids we were, we didn't worry about that. I was sitting there on my four-wheeler, taking in the view, when suddenly my walkie-talkie crackled to life. Naturally, I thought it was my parents trying to reach me, so I quickly responded. At first, the voice was hard to make out, and I didn't recognize it. I asked to confirm it was my dad, but it didn't sound right. Still, I assumed it was him, since I'd talked to him from this spot before, even though the distance was a little farther than usual. I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but there was enough weirdness that I felt slightly annoyed. There were garbled questions and some strange responses, but nothing that hinted at who the person on the other end was. Eventually, the conversation started to drift in a way that made me feel uneasy. At this point, I hadn't yet realized it wasn't my dad, though, since he was always the prankster. Then the guy on the other end made a chilling comment. I can't remember his exact words, but it was enough to make me realize that something was horribly wrong. It was that moment when everything clicked into place, and I realized this wasn't my dad. I had been talking to a stranger for the past 15 minutes while sitting on my four-wheeler near the swim docks. He said, "I can see you. You should come take a ride in my boat." Now, my dad had a boat, but that line felt way off. It made me stop in my tracks. That didn't sound like him at all. "Dad, you're not Dad, are you?" I asked, feeling confused but beginning to get irritated. "What are you talking about?" he replied. I pushed, "If you can see me, what am I wearing?" I said, starting to get angry and suspicious. He paused for a moment before the crackling noise from the walkie-talkie returned. Then he clearly said, "You're wearing an orange shirt. You have red hair, and you're sitting on a red four-wheeler right by the swim docks. Why don't you come ride in my boat?" That's when my stomach dropped, and everything inside me froze. This strange man who I didn't know had been watching me the entire time, and I had no idea where he was. I panicked and quickly looked around, my eyes darting wildly, but I couldn't spot anyone. The fear was instant and paralyzing. Without thinking, I started the four-wheeler, gunning the engine and racing back home as fast as I could. The wheels spun out on the gravel, and I barely managed to keep control of the vehicle as I sped toward home. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I remember stopping in the middle of the yard and bursting into the house, gasping for air. I immediately asked my parents if they had tried to contact me, and to my relief, they hadn't. They hadn't tried to reach me all day. If it had been my dad, he would have confessed immediately, especially since he loved pulling pranks, but this was different. My fear only intensified, knowing how close I had come to a much worse situation. Thankfully, nothing else came of that incident, and life returned to normal at the lake house for a while. Eventually, the weekend visit stopped, and I didn't give much thought to it. But that wasn't the end. During my parents' divorce, I ended up moving into the lake house permanently with my dad. This was the only place we could go while we looked for something more permanent. My father had recently been struggling with health issues, so I got a job at a nearby gas station, tobacco barn, to help pay the bills while he recovered. The job was only for a few months, but it turned out to be the creepiest experience I'd ever had in my life. Within the first month of working there, a tall and obese man began coming into the station, and he quickly became obsessed with me. He had short, crew-cut hair and an unkempt beard and mustache. The first time I encountered him, he stared at me with these wild, unblinking eyes. He stood there ordering gas, just staring at me for what felt like an eternity. I tried to ignore him and go about my job, but it was hard to avoid his gaze. Now, the gas station where I worked was set up like a little glass booth with a small opening through which I took people's money and handed them cigarettes. I was thankful for the glass, as it made me feel somewhat protected from the creepy stares of customers like this man. He came in several times after that, always staring, always awkwardly silent. One day, after he had finished pumping gas and I thought he was leaving, I heard a knock on the glass. When I looked up, there he was, his face pressed against the glass, grinning manically and waving at me with just his fingers. It was enough to send me running for cover. I went to my manager and asked to take a break, desperate to calm myself down before I completely lost it. But the worst encounter happened when he came in one last time. I'll never forget it. He ordered gas like usual, but this time, as I reached to take the cash, he reached through the hole in the glass and grabbed my hand. It wasn't violent, but it was firm enough to keep me from pulling away. I froze, utterly horrified. My heart was racing, and I felt completely trapped. "I love you," he said, his voice low and unnerving. He wouldn't let go of my hand. I was paralyzed, unable to respond. "Say it," he demanded. What? I stammered. "Say you love me." I did, but thought I didn't know what to say, and in my panic, I blurted it out in the hopes it would make him stop. I love you. Call me if you need anything," he added, and then he asked, "What's my number?" I was taken aback by this question, completely confused. "I don't know," I muttered, feeling my stomach drop. Finally, with a grin that made my blood run cold, he said something that shook me to the core. "It's 911. He winked. I was too shaken to say anything else. I just nodded, trying to hold it together long enough for him to let go of my hand. After what felt like an eternity, he finally released me and left, but I was left in a state of shock. Later, I learned that he was a sheriff's deputy. The man who was supposed to protect and serve the community was the one who had been terrorizing me in this twisted way. The realization made my blood run even colder. The person I would have to call in an emergency was the one who had been preying on me. I never saw him again after that, and thankfully, we moved soon after, but I will never forget the creepy grin he gave me every single time he bought gas. A few months ago, I was out driving for DoorDash, which I do as a side gig for about 10 to 15 hours a week. That night, I was only completing a few orders since it was already pretty late, and I had picked up a small order around 1 a.m. It was to be delivered to a business across town, which was clear from the address. This kind of thing is usually typical for late-night shifts, particularly for overnight workers. However, when I pulled into the parking lot, it was completely empty, no cars at all, and I noticed there didn't seem to be any parking at the back of the building either. I parked near the front and grabbed the food. The building appeared to be an office building, smaller than most, just 2 stories, and not very wide. All the lights were off, except for one behind the front door. I checked the app for drop-off instructions, which said I needed to go inside, walk to the main hallway, and leave the food outside of room 232. Looking through the door, I could see a hallway lined with closed doors, which seemed similar to deliveries I had made to hotels, so this wasn't exactly new to me. I tried the door, and it was unlocked, so I stepped inside. I expected to hear people working or talking, but the building was eerily silent. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. As I passed the first few doors, I noticed they were all labeled with numbers in the 100s, like 102 and 106. Since the delivery instructions were for room 232, I assumed it was on the second floor. In the middle of the hallway, there was a doorway leading to the staircase, which was being held open by a doorstop on the floor, though the lights were off. I stepped in and walked up to the base of the stairs, only to find the stairwell completely dark. There was no light coming from above where the room I was delivering to was supposed to be. It was then that I began to feel an uncomfortable chill from the silence. I'm usually one to follow the instructions precisely for good reviews, but at that moment, I felt that something was off. I decided it wasn't worth it and stepped back out of the stairwell into the hallway. Just as I did, the door across from me opened. A man stepped out into the hallway, wearing street clothes that didn't look like office attire at all. He stood in front of me and pointed toward the stairs, telling me that room 232 was upstairs. I nodded but didn't move, and neither did he. He just stood there, staring at me with a look of barely contained anger. After an awkwardly tense few seconds, I quickly dropped the bag on the ground and started walking toward the exit. The man didn't follow me, but I could hear his footsteps as he walked toward the stairwell and headed up. I left the building, got in my car, and drove away, unsure of what had just happened. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, so I didn't report it to the police. The next day, though, the police called me. They said the office had reported a break-in, and they had tracked my car and license plate from the CCTV footage. They also had footage of the break-in itself and wanted to know if I had any information. I didn't have much to offer, but it turned out there were actually 3 men involved in the break-in. One was the man I had seen downstairs, but the others were shown on camera, waiting at the top of the stairs, likely expecting me to go up. It was disturbing to learn that several other delivery orders had been made to that same office that night. All the other drivers had been smarter than I was and had left their orders outside by the front door. What might have happened if I had gone upstairs is anyone's guess, but hopefully, the police will catch the 3 men before anyone else falls victim to whatever they were planning. In another story, I go camping with my dad every summer. He's been doing it his whole life, and recently, I've started joining him. I'm 16, and last year, my dad and I decided to go on our seasonal camping trip. We found a spot online while looking for a new camping area to try out. There were no pictures of the place, but the map was easy to follow, and the description said the trail was easy and uncrowded. We set off on a Friday morning, parked by the side of the road, and began walking down the trail. After the first quarter mile, it became clear that the description was misleading. The trail was pretty steep in places, and much of it was muddy or overgrown, making it much harder than we had expected. Despite that, we pushed on and eventually reached the campsite. It looked just like the rest of the woods we had been walking through for the past 2 hours. Lots of trees and a patch of overgrown grass for us to set up our things on. There were no beautiful views or anything. We set up our tents and made lunch. My dad's a bit of a talker, so we spent the rest of the day chatting. Once the sun started to set, we walked around the trees near our campsite to gather dry sticks for a fire. In the middle of our conversation, we were suddenly interrupted by a loud voice behind us. We both froze, turning around quickly. The woods were unnervingly silent again, and we couldn't see anyone. The voice had sounded like it was not too far away, maybe a mile or so out. For about 30 seconds, neither of us spoke, just staring at the trees and trying to spot any movement. Then it came again, a man's voice, shouting in pain. The scream sent chills through me. It was so raw, filled with distress, like the person was in real trouble. I looked at my dad, and I could see the conflict and worry on his face. He turned me around and quickly led me back to the campsite, starting a fire as he did. The screams kept coming, though, and after a while, I asked him if we should help. I could tell he was considering all the possible outcomes. He looked me in the eyes, serious, and told me to stay by the fire and wait. He said he would run a little way toward the voice to see what he could find, and that if I saw anyone, I was to keep them away from me. I agreed and watched as he sprinted off toward the source of the cries. A minute later, he was out of sight. I wasn't sure what I would have done in my dad's shoes. Leaving someone in obvious distress would have felt terrible, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and who knew what could happen? After 10 minutes, I started feeling uneasy. The sun seemed to be setting faster, and there was still no sign of my dad. Then, suddenly, the screaming stopped. The entire forest was eerily quiet again. I wondered if my dad had found the person and was helping them, or if something else had happened. Another 10 minutes passed with no sign of my dad. As the darkness settled over the woods, my nerves began to build. I stood up, walked a little away from the campsite, and moved in the direction my dad had gone. There were no signs of him, so I kept walking. Finally, I heard footsteps from up ahead. I still couldn't see anything, but the sound of the steps growing louder made my skin crawl, an unsettling feeling creeping up on me. Just before I expected to see my dad, a voice called my name from the left. It was my dad, running toward me, urgently shouting for me to go back. The panic in his voice made me hurry back to the campsite. My dad was right behind me. He quickly packed the essentials into his backpack, and the fear on his face is something I will never forget. It was complete terror, a look of being completely undone. We left our tents behind and ran for the first mile, then fast-walked the rest of the way back to our car. During the drive home, I asked him what he had seen out there, who the man was, and why he had been screaming. My dad didn't say a word. To this day, he refuses to talk about it. Every time I bring it up, his face changes completely, and his demeanor goes blank. I stopped asking after a while. What haunts me now are those footsteps I heard, getting closer and closer. What would have happened if my dad hadn't shown up in time? That's something I'll never know. I was camping in a familiar part of the forest near my city. My city is small, and there's not much to do, so camping is something I really enjoy. I'm not a huge fan of hiking, though. I prefer the more relaxing aspects of camping, like sitting by a fire and having no responsibilities. The trail I took was one I had been on many times before. It was only a 30-minute walk from the parking area, and the campsite was right next to a lake. Since there aren't many people who camp in the area, I didn't expect to see anyone else. But when I arrived, there was already a man with a tent set up by the lake. He looked like he was in his 40s, wearing some generic swimming shorts and a stained white t-shirt. I walked a little farther from his tent and set up mine. After that, I collected some large stones from nearby to make a ring for the campfire I planned to light later. As I did this, I noticed the man watching me. It wasn't just a quick glance. He was standing by the lake, facing me, and staring intently. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked back, he was still there, standing in the same spot, watching me. It got creepy, so I waved at him to see if he wanted to say hello, but after I waved, he turned around and continued walking along the lake. That didn't sit well with me. It made me uncomfortable, and I started to get a strange feeling about him. I kept an eye on him for a while, but nothing happened. After about 20 minutes, he walked away from the lake and into the forest behind his tent. I figured he might have been walking around or following a trail, but I was just relieved he was gone for now. I moved my chair by the lake and relaxed, staying there for an hour or so before I picked it up and moved back to my tent. The sun was starting to set, so I lit my campfire and looked around the forest. That's when I spotted something in the distance. There was a shape next to one of the trees. I squinted to get a better look, and I realized it was the same man. He was standing far behind my campsite, staring in my direction. This was getting really creepy. How long had he been watching me? I moved my chair to the other side of the campfire so I could face him directly and keep an eye on him. He stayed there for a good 30 or 40 minutes, staring at me from the forest. Eventually, it started getting darker, and the shadows made it harder to see him. After a while, I could no longer make out his shape, but I knew he could still see me because my campfire lit up the area. The thought that he was out there, watching me, but I couldn't see him anymore made me really anxious. What was he doing? He had a tent, so he was clearly camping, but in the hours I had been there, I never saw him go back to it. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I was worried that he might follow me if I did. So I sat by the fire, making sure it didn't go out, and just waited. Several long, tiring hours passed, and I didn't see anything else. He never came back to his tent, nor did he come close enough for me to see him again. When the sun came up, I looked around and saw no signs of him. I quickly packed up my gear and left for my car. It was hard to know what that guy's intentions were, but if I hadn't been cautious and stayed awake, who knows what could have happened. A few days later, I was camping again, this time in a forest a few hours from my town. I had set up camp at the end of a 4-hour trail. I had already spent the night there, and the next day, I noticed a narrow path leading out from the campsite. It wasn't on the map, and I had no idea where it went, but I had nothing better to do, so I decided to check it out. Maybe it led to a small pond or waterfall. I packed a backpack with food and water in case I ended up staying longer than expected. The trail was very thin, and it was clear that not many people had used it, at least not recently. The path was overgrown in places, and there were no signs of recent use like shoe prints. I walked for several miles, taking about 2 hours before I finally reached the end. It wasn't what I expected. There was a house, or rather, a cabin, sitting in the woods. It was clearly abandoned. Moss and vines were growing over the wooden siding, and all the doors and windows were open. Before going any further, I looked around, trying to assess the situation. The woods were unnervingly still and quiet. I approached the doorway and peeked inside. The front hallway was filled with dust and debris, but it was otherwise empty. As I ventured deeper into the cabin, the smell of mildew and rotting wood filled the air. The rooms were mostly barren, with little to see. Feeling uneasy, I was about to turn around and leave, but something caught my eye, a glimmer coming from one of the closed wooden doors. The handle had been ripped off, and instead, there was a shiny silver padlock on it. The padlock looked brand new, and it didn't match anything else in the house. My curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself wondering why there was a padlock on a door in such an empty, decaying cabin. The more I looked at it, the more uneasy I became, and that feeling quickly overpowered my curiosity. I decided not to investigate further and quickly left the cabin. As I stepped back onto the trail, I heard a single footstep from inside the house. I turned around and glanced at the doorway, but I saw nothing. I kept walking, trying to distance myself from the unsettling place. But as I walked, I started hearing footsteps again, this time seemingly following me. The dense trees made it hard to see anything beyond a few feet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me. I continued walking for about 2 hours, and when I finally returned to my camp, I immediately started a fire and sat by it, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of movement. As the night went on, I started hearing the footsteps again, coming from far beyond the reach of my campfire's light. The sound would come every 10 to 15 minutes, but no matter how hard I tried, I never saw anyone. Eventually, the hours dragged on, and I knew I had to sleep, so I left the campfire burning as I crawled into my tent. I barely slept that night, waking at every small noise the woods made. The next morning, there was no sign of anyone around, so I packed up and left, unsure of who or what had followed me, but deeply disturbed by the experience. I'll never know what the person intended or why they were following me, but the thought of it still haunts me. The locked door in that cabin is something I can't stop thinking about, and I'll never know what might have been behind it. There's an abandoned hotel in my town that's been vacant for decades. It's been bought out a few times, but each time, the businesses that tried to run it went bankrupt within a few years. Our town is small and old-fashioned, so there's really no reason for anyone to visit unless they have family here. Despite that, the hotel was huge, at least 6 stories, making it the largest building in town. When I was 23, I decided to check it out, thinking there was nothing particularly dangerous or scary about it. It was just an empty building, and I thought it would be cool to walk around and explore. I decided to go during the day, figuring if anyone was there, they were probably just other curious explorers like me. I parked at a store half a mile away and walked to the hotel, which was mostly isolated since the stores around it had long been torn down. The hotel was in worse shape, and I remembered the brick was crumbling, and the whole place looked faded and decayed. I went up to the front and peeked inside. It was mostly empty, with just a few pieces of old furniture scattered around. I stepped inside and walked through the lobby, opening the door to the staircase. The stairwell was shadowed, with only a faint beam of light coming from one of the floors above. It barely lit the way, but it was enough to guide me up the stairs. When I reached the second floor, I found the door blocked. Something on the other side was preventing it from opening, and a sheet of wood was covering the window on the door. I left it and continued up to the 3rd floor, where I opened another door and entered the hallway. This floor was easily the creepiest setting I'd ever encountered. The hallway was dark and musty, with only small windows at each end providing minimal light. I walked down a bit and entered the first room with an open door. Oddly, it looked fairly normal. Dust had covered everything, but the furniture was arranged as if it had never been moved. Even towels and soap were left in the bathroom. As I stood there, I heard a faint thud. I turned to face the doorway, unsure whether the sound came from my floor or the one below. A few moments later, I heard quiet footsteps creaking on the floorboards, getting closer. I just stared at the doorway, hoping they weren't on my floor. After a few seconds, the footsteps stopped, followed by a door opening and then slamming shut on the floor below me. After that, there was complete silence. I tried to stay calm, walking toward the hallway and checking for anyone else, but there was no one in sight. The more I thought about it, the more unnerving it seemed. Why would someone exploring the place move so deliberately to a room and then slam the door? I grew increasingly nervous, and the silence only added to the tension. After standing there for a minute, I decided I'd had enough. I quietly walked back to the staircase, opened the door, and started descending. The metal stairs were loud, each step echoing with a hollow thud. As I passed the door to the second floor, I noticed a small gap in the doorway that hadn't been there before. I looked down at the stairs ahead and froze. A figure stood in the stairwell, only a few steps below me. They were barely visible in the darkness, but their eyes were staring right at me. With no other choice, I began to carefully walk along the edge of the staircase, keeping as quiet as possible. The figure's eyes never left me, following every step I took as I passed within a few feet of them. I made it to the bottom of the stairs, and without wasting any time, I opened the door and ran out into the lobby where I could finally see clearly. I hurried back to my car and sat there in the parking lot for a while, trying to process what had just happened. Looking back, I realized that it was probably the dumbest thing I'd ever done. I didn't fully understand what I had walked into, and I wasn't sure what the person in the hotel was doing or why they were there. But leaving when I did was probably the only smart decision I made. A few weeks later, I was driving back from my friend's place in Wisconsin. I live just outside of Chicago, which is about a 6-hour drive, so I decided to do it all in one go. However, I didn't anticipate leaving so late. I didn't hit the road until 8 p.m., but I had to be home for work the next day, so I couldn't afford to stay much longer. If you're not familiar with Wisconsin, it's mostly flat with a ton of forests in the northern parts and small towns scattered throughout. The bigger cities are closer to the border, far from where I was. My friend's place was in one of those small towns, so right from the start, it was just barren forest roads. A few cars passed by, but once I was 30 minutes out and the sun had set, there wasn't a single other car on the road. I probably went a full 2 hours without seeing anyone else, and the endless, flat forest on either side was making me sleepy. It certainly didn't help that I was exhausted from the weekend. I tried everything to stay awake, but around 11 p.m., I saw something up ahead. I rubbed my eyes and realized it was a person standing on the shoulder of the road with their thumb out, clearly looking for a ride. For some reason, the first thought that came to mind was that having company in the car might help keep me awake. Almost instinctively, I began slowing down. As I got closer, the person started walking toward my car. I rolled the window down and pulled up next to them. "Hey, I just need a ride into the next town if you've got a spare seat," the man said. It was really dark, and I couldn't see much of him, but his voice sounded tired. I let him into the back seat. It wasn't until I started pulling away that the thought crossed my mind. Why was he out here in the middle of the woods at this hour? I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him sitting in the back, staring at me from the shadows. He looked to be around 30, with stubble and a buzz cut, but I didn't see a backpack or anything with him. I asked, "So what brings you out here?" He answered with a straight face, then gave a fake smile. "Oh, I was just walking on a trail in the woods and got lost. Found the road and figured I'd catch a ride." I thought about his response for a second. I didn't know about any trails around here, and even if there were, he would have had to drive to get to this point. Why didn't he mention that he wanted to be dropped off at the trailhead instead of in town? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. But before I could say anything else, the man suddenly told me to pull over. "Stop here," he said. I cautiously did as he asked, pulling onto the shoulder and parking. We were about 5 miles from where I picked him up, and there was still nothing but dense forest all around. Without a word, the man opened the door and rushed away into the trees. I was freaked out and just wanted to leave, but as I leaned into the back seat to shut the door, I noticed a drawstring bag tucked under the passenger seat. It wasn't mine, it was definitely his. I called out to him, "Hey, you left your bag." He stopped, turned around, and stared at me with a frustrated look for several long, uncomfortable seconds. Then he came back, grabbed the bag abruptly, and rushed off into the woods without a word. I quickly shut the door and drove off, relieved to be away from him. But just a few minutes down the road, I started to notice an awful smell coming from the back seat. It got worse and worse over the next 30 minutes. By the time I reached a small town and stopped at a gas station, I used my phone's light to check the back seat. There, on the carpet under the passenger seat where the bag had been, was a deep red stain. I almost threw up as I rushed into the gas station and called the police. I gave them all the details about what happened, and they took a piece of the carpet from my car to have it tested. They also searched for the man, but came up empty, only finding a few footprints near where I had picked him up. I don't know exactly what was in that bag, but it seems like he was trying to plant it in my car as a way to cover something up. To this day, we still have no idea who he was or what he was up to that night. A few weeks later, I was working a quick DoorDash shift on a Monday night. I finished my day job at 7 p.m. and decided to make a few deliveries. It was a pretty regular, quiet night with nothing out of the ordinary. I completed about 7 or 8 orders before taking my last one for the night. After dropping off the last order, I started heading back to town, where my apartment was. It was around 10 p.m., and I was about 20 minutes outside town, driving through the farmlands that surrounded it. A couple of minutes into my drive, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, and the man moved over a little bit, but not enough to completely get out of my way. As I got closer, he looked right at me and stuck his thumb out. In my headlights, I could tell he was an older man, probably in his early 50s, with a large backpack on his shoulders. Since I was already slowing down, I figured I'd be helpful and offer him a ride into the city since I was headed that way. He leaned on the window sill and thanked me for stopping. His eyes looked heavy, like he hadn't slept in days, but he seemed nice enough, so I agreed to give him a ride. What I wasn't expecting, though, was for him to immediately open the passenger door and sit down next to me. It didn't matter much, but I felt like it was usually more courteous to sit in the back seat. As he settled in, I looked past him at the field of tall grass where he seemed to have come from. "You from around here? What brings you out to the farmlands?" I asked. He looked over at me and said, "Just making my way across the country to visit my family. Don't have a car, so I've been hitching rides." I thought that was interesting and asked more about where he was from, but he gave me vague and uninterested answers. A few times, I noticed him looking into the back seat, not just quick glances, but more like he was scanning it, looking for something. Something about him started to feel off. He wasn't talking much, and his behavior was just unusual. "Is everything okay?" I asked. I still had my eyes on the road, but he didn't answer. When I looked over at him, I saw his disturbing stare, and that's when I noticed the knife clenched in his right hand. "Stop the car," he demanded. I didn't say a word and parked right in the middle of the road. I was terrified and figured that if I just let him take whatever he wanted, I might get out unharmed. As soon as the car was in park, I turned to open my door, but he quickly stopped me. "Get in the back," he ordered, still clutching the knife. I froze for a moment, realizing we were in the middle of empty fields, and if I got in the back, I might never have another chance to escape. That's when I noticed his large backpack was slightly open by his feet, revealing a thick bundle of rope. I had no choice but to try and escape now, before it was too late. I opened the door and jumped out in one swift motion. The man tried to jump across the front seat to grab me, but I sprinted to the other side of the road and into the tall grass. I kept running until I felt like he couldn't find me. I stood still, listening. He yelled a few times from the road, but then it went quiet. All I could hear was the wind blowing through the grass. I stood there motionless for about 15 minutes before slowly making my way back toward the road. I peeked through the grass and saw my headlights still beaming onto the pavement, with the driver's door still open. The man was nowhere to be seen. After scanning the area for another minute, I quickly grabbed my phone, ran back into the grass, and called 911. I wasn't sure if he was still hiding nearby, so I didn't want to risk staying in the open. Eventually, the police showed up, and I couldn't believe the man hadn't driven off with my car. He must have grabbed his backpack and run into the other field, or maybe even tried chasing me through the grass and didn't find me. Either way, it was clear his intentions weren't just to rob me, which made the whole situation 100 times more disturbing. I gave the police a description of the man, but there still haven't been any sightings of him. This past August, I had one of the scariest experiences of my life. It was a quiet Saturday evening, and I was home alone. My mom and sister were out shopping, and my dad was working late. I decided to spend the evening gaming with my friends Griffin and Broly to relax after a tough couple of weeks of school. Around 8 p.m., after burning a batch of pizza rolls, I finally logged on, but my friends didn't last long. After an hour of losses, they called it a night. Feeling bored and restless, I decided to lie down and scroll on my phone. That plan quickly changed when I heard my two dogs barking outside. It wasn't unusual for them to bark at people walking by, but something felt off. Curious, I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. Then, I heard the garage door open and shut. This sound typically meant my dad was home, but his van wasn't in the driveway. He'd also texted earlier saying he'd be working late. Alarmed, I went downstairs to the dining room for a better look. The driveway was empty, and the street was silent. Uneasy, I ran back to my room and texted my family group chat. My mom told me to turn off the lights, lock my bedroom door, and wait until they returned. About 15 minutes later, I thought I heard faint creaking from the wooden floor downstairs, like someone trying to move stealthily. Panic set in. I didn't have anything to defend myself with. Improvising, I unclipped the boom arm from my microphone and slowly opened my bedroom door. I crept to the upstairs balcony overlooking the living room and called out, "Is anybody there?" My voice echoed in the silence, but I wasn't ready for what happened next. A large silhouette appeared beneath the balcony, standing completely still. My heart stopped. I bolted for the nearest room with a locking door, my small bathroom, and locked myself inside. Seconds later, loud, fast footsteps thundered up the stairs. My hands were trembling. I realized I'd left my phone in my bedroom, just a door away. Summoning all the courage I could, I sprinted out of the bathroom, locked myself in my bedroom, and grabbed my phone. Across the hall, my sister's room had its door open, a detail that sent chills down my spine because I hadn't touched it. As I turned to call 911, I noticed something horrifying. The storage closet embedded in my wall was ajar, and through the narrow gap, I saw an eye staring at me. Frozen with terror, I dropped everything and bolted downstairs, out the front door, and up the hill to my neighbor's house. My neighbor, a police officer, immediately called for backup while his wife stayed with me. Minutes later, I saw him heading down to my house with a flashlight. I stayed back, praying the intruder would be caught. When I returned, I saw my neighbor pinning a tall, skinny man with a gray beard and dirty black coat to the floor as he cuffed him. It was the same man I'd spotted earlier in the evening, lingering by the house. Apparently, he had climbed onto the roof, causing the thud I'd heard earlier. He managed to enter through an upstairs window, one I hadn't thought to lock. The most unsettling part, the man had been hiding in the storage closet in my room, waiting. My parents were horrified when they came home, but they were grateful I was unharmed and for our neighbors' bravery. Since then, my family installed a robust security system, and I'm never left home alone anymore. I wouldn't wish this kind of experience on anyone. A camping trip gone wrong just over 2 years ago. I decided to try camping for the first time. My name is Jake, and at the time, I had no experience in camping or hiking. I'd been wanting to try it for a while, and I figured the best way to learn was to go out and do it. I picked a campground 2 hours from my city that seemed ideal, not too crowded, but also not completely isolated. After arriving at the trailhead around noon, I hiked a few hours to reach the site. The campground had picnic tables, barbecue grills, and several smaller trails leading to individual campsites. I chose a spot, set up my tent, and ensured everything was working properly. A few other campers were in the central area, grilling and chatting. I wasn't very social, so I stayed by myself until one of them, a guy about my age named TJ, invited me to join. He seemed friendly, so I tagged along, meeting a few others and spending the next hour hanging out. As the sun began to set, I said goodnight and returned to my tent. Not long after, TJ came by, asking if I'd ever been to the area before. When I said no, he started talking about a hidden lake nearby, calling it a must-see spot. Intrigued, I agreed to follow him. He led me down a faint trail through the woods, claiming it was only a 10-minute walk. But as time passed, there was no lake in sight. TJ, once talkative and charismatic, grew quiet, offering only one-word responses. He kept glancing at the sunset, making me feel like he was waiting for something in the dark. Uneasy, I began putting distance between us. Finally, I turned and ran back the way we came. TJ noticed immediately, shouting after me. His tone started friendly, as if trying to convince me to come back, but quickly turned angry. I could hear him sprinting behind me. At one point, I heard a loud metallic clang, a knife hitting a tree near me. It must have been his last effort to stop me. I kept running until I reached the main campsite, where I told the others what happened. The police were called, but TJ, or whoever he was, disappeared. He had no tent or gear at the campsite, and no one knew much about him. I later realized he probably targeted me because I was inexperienced and alone. Whatever his intentions were, I'm thankful I listened to my instincts and ran. If I hadn't, I doubt I'd be here to tell this story. Story 1. The Airbnb intruder. This happened almost 2 years ago when I decided to take a vacation to visit my parents. To have some space for myself, I rented an Airbnb for the first time. The house was located on a large, quiet plot of land and was incredibly spacious. Coming from the city, it felt like pure luxury. After settling into the room, I quickly left to spend the afternoon with my family. Later that night, I returned to the Airbnb, made a snack, and relaxed on the couch to watch a movie. It was around 10 or 11 p.m. when I heard footsteps outside the house. The sound startled me because there was no mistaking it. Someone was walking near the house. I paused the movie and went to the back of the house to investigate. Peeking out the back door into the darkness, I saw a man walking away from the house toward the tree line. What really disturbed me was that I hadn't heard him approach. He must have been standing near the house for some time before I noticed. Once he was out of sight, I opened the back door and stepped outside. The patio was empty, but there were clear shoe prints in the grass leading up to one of the windows. When I looked through the window, my heart sank. The man had been standing in a spot with a direct view of the couch where I was sitting. The thought of him watching me, completely unaware, sent chills through my body. I quickly went back inside, locked the doors, and covered the windows. For the next half hour, I sat in the living room, the movie playing on low volume so I could listen for any sounds. I didn't hear anything more, and once the movie ended, I decided to check outside one last time before heading to bed. Pulling the curtains aside, I saw nothing at first, but then I heard footsteps fast and heavy sprinting away from the window. Hesitant, I peeked out and caught a glimpse of the same man running into the trees. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, the man was long gone. As we searched the house, I noticed something even more unsettling. My suitcase in the bedroom had been opened, its contents rummaged through, and a few items were missing. I realized the man had likely entered the house earlier while I was with my family. He could have still been inside when I returned, sneaking out without me noticing. What horrifies me most is the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't caught him watching me. I might have gone to bed with him still lurking nearby. Village and Belle's story. My knuckles ache from gripping the steering wheel too hard, and the rental car's headlights barely pierce the suffocating darkness around me. The road beneath has devolved from asphalt to cracked gravel. My GPS lost signal nearly an hour ago, and there's no sign of streetlights or familiar landmarks. Just a lonely stretch of night, the occasional silhouette of leaning wooden fences on either side, and my own shallow breaths. The fences seem to press in, their angles tilted as though trying to whisper secrets through the windows. This trip wasn't supposed to be like this. I'm here on business, a contract negotiation in some forgotten factory town. I promised my family I'd return by the weekend, but now it's well past midnight, and I'm nowhere near the main highway. The oppressive night feels like it's closing in on me, and though the air is cool, sweat beads on my temple. I should have stopped at a motel hours ago, but my stubbornness convinced me to press on. A mistake. Every instinct screams that something's wrong. I ease off the gas, straining to see beyond the reach of my headlights. Then, up ahead, the faint outline of buildings emerges, weathered rooftops and leaning chimneys against a moonless sky. I pull over, killing the engine. The silence is immediate, the kind that swallows all sound, even my breathing. Gravel crunches beneath my shoes as I step out. "Hello," I call out, my voice hollow, absorbed by the night. No response. The settlement is larger than a single farmhouse. It might have been a village once. Boarded windows, sagging porches, and peeling paint tell of abandonment. I push open a rusty gate that squeals in protest, stepping into what could have been a town square. My flashlight flickers across furniture left to decay, a lace-draped table, a sofa with torn upholstery. Opposite me hangs an oval mirror, its cracked frame clinging to a darkened surface. I avert my gaze, unwilling to look at my reflection here. The air is thick, carrying a stale smell of rot and mildew. Each step stirs dust motes that swirl in my flashlight's beam. "Anyone here?" I try again, my voice small in the cavernous silence. Still nothing. Then I hear it, a bell, faint and distant. I freeze. Another chime follows, softer and higher pitched. The sound drifts from somewhere further down the street. My pulse quickens as I follow the sound. Around a corner, I find a tall wooden post with a frayed rope holding a bell that sways gently in the still air. There's no wind, no mechanism to move it, yet it rings a soft, almost kind tone. But each note sends a chill up my spine. Ahead, more bells come into view, one perched atop a chimney, another dangling from a window latch, a third beneath a porch roof. Each bell rings in turn, their tones forming a dissonant, ghostly choir. The sounds feel deliberate, almost as though they're communicating. My stomach tightens, my skin prickling with unease. I know these bells are talking about me. I pick a larger building, a two-story structure with a crooked sign that might once have read Draper's Shop. The door groans open, and I step inside. The air is damp and heavy. Broken shelves and scattered objects lie in disarray. On a counter, I find an old ledger. Its pages are brittle, covered in cramped handwriting. The entries list dates from decades past, stopping abruptly with no explanation, no farewell or record of evacuation. Just blank pages, after a final scribble. My flashlight shakes in my grip as the bells outside continue their haunting chorus. I move to a back room, where a cot sits untouched. Exhaustion pulls at me, but the air feels charged, as though I'm not alone. I sit with my back against a damp wall, my legs trembling, hands unsteady as I sip from my water bottle. My throat is dry, and every swallow feels like gravel. The thought of leaving gnaws at me. I could try to find my way back to the car, drive until I'm free of this place. But I'm not even sure I can navigate the maze of cracked roads. And the bells, they pull at me, their mystery anchoring me here, as if I have to understand them before I can leave. Forcing myself back outside, I glance at my watch. It's almost 2 a.m. The moon hangs as a thin crescent, casting faint light on sagging rooftops. The bells are quieter now, but their voices seem scattered, hidden behind closed doors, nestled in chimneys, or perched on forgotten lamp posts without lamps. They feel omnipresent, embedded in every shadowed corner. As I pass another crumbling house, a sudden gust of wind kicks up dust, stinging my eyes. I rub them, coughing, and when my vision clears, I notice a tall standing mirror through a half-open door. Its heavy wooden frame is carved with twisting vines, far more intricate than the first mirror I saw. Something about it draws me in. I step inside, my flashlight jittering over dusty furniture. The mirror's surface is darkened, smudged with grime, but I can see the faint outline of my silhouette. Slowly, I approach, raising a trembling hand to wipe away a patch of dirt. My reflection stares back, wide-eyed and uncertain. Then, a single bell chimes soft, warm, almost a whisper. I spin around, flashlight sweeping the empty room, but there's no one there. The bell rings again, this time from above. I move cautiously into a side room, a kitchen, perhaps, and find a tiny bell hanging from the corner of a cabinet. It's so small I'm shocked I even noticed it, yet its sound is sharp and clear, like a gentle tap on glass. Suddenly, other bells join in, their tones overlapping in a strange harmony that feels almost conversational. My heart races as I backpedal toward the mirror. In its reflection, I see myself and something else. For a fleeting second, a figure looms behind me, a shape with hollow eyes. I whirl around, but the room is empty. My skin crawls, exhaustion weighs heavy, and my thoughts grow tangled. The bells sound almost like they're shaping words. My name whispered in haunting, fractured tones, Ya Sun. Ya Sun. I gasp for air, sweat running down my back, and stumble out onto the street. In my haste, I trip over a broken step, falling hard and scraping my palms. Pain anchors me briefly, but above, the sky seems to press closer, the silence between each bell's chime thick and suffocating. I push myself up and start walking, then running, the bells ringing faster now, not frantic, but in a rhythm I can't comprehend. Turning a corner, I nearly crash into another bell, this one tied to a rusted pitchfork planted in the ground. I dart into what looks like a general store, desperate for relief, hoping to find something to block my ears. Inside, I grab a dusty apron from a stack, wrapping it around my head in a clumsy attempt to muffle the sound. My breath comes in gasps as I glance at my reflection in the window. The apron looks absurd, but something else catches my eye, the warped reflection of the door behind me. In the distortion, I see a pair of eyes that aren't mine, staring back. My pulse spikes as I spin around, but the door is just a door, plain and solid. A deep, resonant clang reverberates through the air, coming from the village square. Compelled by a mix of terror and curiosity, I follow it. At the center of the square stands a tall pole with a massive bell at its peak, weathered and ancient, perhaps a church bell. I approach, legs shaking, and sense movement behind me. Turning quickly, I find only darkness, but the sensation of being watched lingers. The smaller bells chime again, their tones slower now, layered into a low hum that resonates in my chest like a second heartbeat. Invisible eyes seem to watch from behind every shutter, every crumbling eave. My skin prickles as though tiny insects crawl beneath it. I take a deep breath and force myself to leave. Stumbling down the main street, past the silent houses, I listen as the bells grow fainter with every step. At last, I reach my car. Relief washes over me like cold water on a burn as I slide into the driver's seat, hands trembling, and start the engine. The headlights flick on, illuminating a sign at the village entrance that I hadn't noticed before. In the windshield's reflection, the glass feels like a mirror. I see something pale moving between the houses. The bells chime one last time my name, clear and unmistakable, and then fall silent. Heart pounding, I press the gas and speed away. The roar of the engine breaks the oppressive quiet, but I can't shake the feeling that the village isn't finished with me. Even as I reach the open road, my hands shake uncontrollably, my chest tight with unease. The faint hum of the bells lingers in my ears, just below the edge of hearing. At dawn, I find a diner. Its neon lights and the smell of coffee feel foreign after the night I've had. In the bathroom, I splash cold water on my face and glance at the mirror. For a brief second, my reflection flickers, and I hear the faintest chime. Exhaustion must be playing tricks on me, or perhaps not. Deep down, I know the village isn't truly behind me. The memory of the bells hums softly, waiting, patient. I fear they'll ring my name again. They say boredom will drive a cop to do dumb things. Hell, they're right. The year was 1997, and I was working as a small-town cop in Lewis, Nebraska. You've probably never heard of it, no one has. Nothing ever happened there except the occasional speeding ticket or the town drunk getting rowdy at the local bar. I'd been on the job for nearly 8 years, and in all that time, I never thought I'd encounter anything that would make me question my sanity or my survival. The name's Rob Teague. No, not the most glamorous name, but it works. I'm what you'd call a functional guy. I get things done. I didn't grow up with much. My parents weren't what you'd call nurturing, and I sure as hell didn't have some grand dream of being a cop. But here I was, stuck with a badge in a town where the most dangerous thing I dealt with was runaway livestock. Lewis was quiet. Too quiet. It was a regular Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. Doesn't really matter. I was working the late shift, driving the empty streets, sipping stale coffee. The radio crackled a little, but there were no calls, just the dull hum of my cruiser's engine. Then I got a call, not from dispatch, but from Ed Rourke, one of the old farmers on the outskirts of town. Ed wasn't the type to call the cops unless something serious was up. "Rob, you gotta get out here," he said, his voice shaky. Something ain't right. Now, Ed's the kind of guy who can spot a problem with his cattle from a mile away. He doesn't exaggerate. If he says something isn't right, something's wrong. I tossed the coffee out the window, hit the lights, and made my way to Ed's farm. When I pulled up, Ed was standing on his porch, shotgun in hand, looking pale as a ghost. I made a joke about how the shotgun didn't suit him anymore, but he wasn't laughing. "Over there," he said, nodding toward the field behind his barn. "Something's been tearing up the livestock," Ed said, his voice low. "2 of my cows gone. Dragged off. Rob, the others are spooked real bad." Ed wasn't one to exaggerate. A man of few words, and those few always meant something serious. I wasn't about to dismiss him like some city slicker. I grabbed my flashlight and gun, gesturing for Ed to follow. We headed out toward the field. The grass was trampled, a path leading into the woods bordering his property. Deep gouges scored the dirt, like something had dragged heavy bodies away. But no blood, no tracks, just weird, deep grooves clawed into the earth. "You sure it wasn't a wolf?" I asked, though I knew damn well we hadn't had wolves around here for decades. "I know what a wolf looks like," Ed muttered. "This ain't no wolf. Whatever it is, it's big and smart." We followed the trail, and the deeper we got into the woods, the heavier the air seemed to feel. Like the forest itself didn't want us there. You ever get that feeling like you're being watched? It hit me all at once, like a punch to the gut. I didn't say anything, but Ed must have felt it till he stopped dead in his tracks. That's when we heard it, rustling in the trees. Something moving, no creeping. I raised my flashlight, sweeping it across the woods. For a second, I caught a flash of movement. It was big, real big. At first, I thought it might be a grizzly, but the way it moved. No bear moved like that, low to the ground, crawling, jerky and unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. "Jesus Christ," Ed whispered, clutching his shotgun tighter. The thing, whatever it was, bolted. It moved too fast for something that size, and disappeared into the trees. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It lingered, just out of reach, like it was waiting. "We should go back," I said. Ed nodded, and we started back toward the farm, picking up the pace. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the thing to charge us. It didn't, at least not yet. When we got back to the house, Ed slammed the door behind us, locking it and double-checking the windows, like that would stop whatever was out there. "What the hell was that thing?" he finally asked. "I don't know," I said, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. "Look, I'll file a report, maybe get some of the boys to do a sweep of the area tomorrow. But you need to stay inside tonight." Ed just nodded, staring out into the dark. I left Ed's place and drove back to town, but the whole way I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just because I'd seen something impossible, it was the way it moved, the way it felt like it was waiting. Back at the station, I sat down to write the report, but I didn't get far. How do you describe something like that? Unidentified large animal, possibly a bear, yeah, right? No one was going to buy that. Just before dawn, the phone rang, another call. This time, it was Carol Winters, who ran the local diner. She was hysterical, babbling about how her son hadn't come home last night. He'd been out with friends, hiking in the woods near the old mill. "I'll head out there right away," I told her. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was just starting to rise. A few of the boys' friends were still there, pale and shaking. One of them, Mitch, was trying to explain what had happened, but he wasn't making much sense. We saw something," he stammered. "We thought it was a deer at first, but then it stood up." "It wasn't a deer." I pushed for details, but Mitch wasn't in any state to give a coherent answer. All I got was that something came at them from the trees, and they ran. But Carol's son, Jake, didn't make it out. He wasn't fast enough. I radioed for backup and began searching the area with a few other officers. The woods were thick, the trees casting long shadows that made everything feel claustrophobic. We spread out, calling Jake's name, hoping he was just lost or hiding. Then we found him, or at least what was left of him. His body was torn apart, like it had been caught in a shredder. There wasn't much left that was recognizable, just chunks of flesh and bones scattered across the ground. It was hard to believe this had once been a person. My stomach churned, but I kept it together. The others weren't so lucky. One of the younger officers puked right there on the spot. We didn't say much after that. Just packed up what little we could and radioed it in. There was no way to spin this. I couldn't call it an animal attack. Nothing I knew could do something like that. Not this cleanly, not this viciously. By the time we got back to the station, word had already spread through town. In small places like Lewis, news travels fast. People were scared, and rightly so. The rumor mill started churning, and soon everyone had their own theory about what was out there. But no one knew for sure. No one had answers. That night, I stayed up with my gun by my side, staring out the window of my apartment. Every little noise outside made me jump, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Heart pounding, I slowly moved to the window and peeked outside. There, just at the edge of my porch, was something I couldn't quite make out. It was dragging one of the Bada's Jake's body across the ground, like it was nothing. I should have shot it. I should have done something, but I froze. Just stood there, watching as it disappeared into the darkness, dragging its prize with it. Then, just like that, it was gone. The feeling of dread lifted, and everything went quiet. The next morning, I called in sick. No one questioned it. To this day, I have no idea why he was in my house or what he wanted, and that uncertainty still haunts me. Story 1. A late night breakdown. I was leaving work late due to a recent security issue at my company that had everyone working overtime. Normally, I'd take the train, but knowing I'd be out past its running hours, I drove instead. The drive home was nearly an hour, and as I left the city, I noticed my gas gauge was almost empty. I didn't remember it being this low earlier, but I assumed I'd missed it in my exhaustion. I planned to fill up at a gas station near my house, but 10 minutes later, my dashboard flashed a warning that my fuel was critically low. The needle had dropped far faster than it should have, and soon after, my car started sputtering before the engine cut out entirely. Frustrated and confused, I pulled over and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment to investigate. It only took a few seconds to find the problem. Gas was leaking from my tank. I had no idea how this could have happened, as everything seemed fine earlier. Before I could process it, a truck pulled up behind me. Its headlights were off, and it parked quickly and decisively. I stood up, aiming my flashlight at the windshield, where I saw a couple of figures moving inside. "I'm okay, don't need any help," I called out, but they didn't respond. Instead, one of the truck's doors opened and a man stepped out. "Need a ride?" he asked, smirking as he approached. Something about his tone made my skin crawl. I declined firmly and quickly got back into my car, locking the doors. The man stood outside my window for what felt like an eternity, staring at me silently. I called the police, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. Eventually, he walked back to the truck, got in, and drove off slowly. As he passed, I glanced at his back seat and froze. Someone was pressed against the window, wide-eyed and motionless. It didn't look like they were there willingly. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They found that my gas tank had been intentionally punctured, likely by someone who'd followed me, hoping I'd accept their help. Unfortunately, the truck's license plate was missing, and the man was never found. To this day, I wonder about the person in the back seat and what might have happened if I hadn't locked my doors. You know, working as a small-town cop has its moments. Most of them aren't great paperwork, dealing with petty nonsense, and listening to people complain about their neighbors being too loud or parking wrong. But every now and then, something comes along that shakes you to your core, makes you question what's out there. It was 2003. I remember because I had just moved back home after a few years in the city. My name's Trent McKay, by the way. I came back because I thought life would be quieter out here, simpler. I figured I'd take over for the sheriff when he retired, but he wasn't going anywhere soon. For now, I was stuck in routine, until that one night. Sudden Creek's a peaceful enough place, nestled in the Oklahoma hills where life's slower. People tend to keep to themselves, and not much happens. But in late July, dispatch got a call about some campers that hadn't returned. I figured it was nothing, maybe they just lost track of time or decided to stay longer, but I had this gut feeling, you know. Something felt off. Go check it out, Trent. It's probably just a couple of city slickers who got themselves turned around, Sheriff Harlan said with his usual half-amused tone. He didn't take much seriously unless it involved his lunch break. So, I headed out to the woods where they'd supposedly been camping. Sudden Creek Forest isn't the kind of place you get lost easily, but when you do, you're screwed. The trees here seem to close in on you, and there's a weird hush in the air, like everything's watching, or maybe I'm just getting old and paranoid. Anyway, I'm driving my patrol car down this narrow dirt road. By then, it's already dusk, and the light's starting to fade. I pull up to the trailhead, step out, and call into dispatch. McKay, checking out the last known location. No sign of the campers yet. I hear some garbled response about checking in soon, but the signal is terrible out here. Doesn't matter. I grab my flashlight and head into the woods. After about 30 minutes of walking, I find their camped tents, a small fire pit, and some chairs knocked over like they left in a hurry. It's dead quiet, and the air feels too still. You know, like the forest had forgotten how to make noise. No birds, no crickets, nothing. I poke around the campsite, looking for anything that might tell me where they went. Their gear was still their cooler full of beer, some hiking boots, and an open map flapping against a tree trunk. One of the tents had a few bloodstains on the entrance, not a lot, but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I called it in, but I doubted anyone would come out right away. It's not unusual for people to have a minor accident while camping, get spooked, and run off. Maybe they fell and hurt themselves, but then I found the trail. The ground was disturbed, like someone had been dragged. Now, I'm not a tracker or anything, but even I could see it led deeper into the woods. I was halfway down it when I realized something else. The drag marks didn't look like they came from shoes or boots. No, it was almost like something on all fours had scraped across the dirt. I should have turned back. I should have called for backup, but I didn't. Maybe it was my ego, or maybe I just didn't want to look like a coward in front of the sheriff. As I followed the trail, the trees thickened, and the underbrush became dense. The air felt even heavier. That's when I saw it about 20 feet ahead. There was this thing. It was hunched over something, tearing into it. At first, I thought it was a wild animal, a mountain lion or something. But it wasn't. The thing was big with a body that moved in jerky, unnatural ways. Its skin looked leathery, stretched tight over bulging muscles. I tried to think of what animal it could be, but nothing matched. I stepped on a branch, and it snapped, loud to loud. The thing turned its head toward me, slow, deliberate. I won't lie to you, my first thought was, oh crap, I'm dead. But I froze. Not out of bravery or anything like that. My brain just couldn't process what I was seeing. It had these strange limbs, long and spindly, almost insect-like, but thicker, with clawed tips. The thing didn't have fur, just patches of coarse hair around its shoulders. Its head was shaped wrong, elongated, like it had a snout, but not quite right. The closest thing I could compare it to was a diseased wolf, but this wasn't any wolf. Before I could react, it lunged. Yeah, I know lunge is one of those words that makes everything seem dramatic, but there's no better way to describe how it came at me, quick, vicious. I had a split second to draw my gun, but I was too slow. It was on me in an instant. It slashed at my shoulder with those claws, and I felt a searing pain as I hit the ground. I fired twice. The shots were loud, deafening in the quiet woods. I must have hit it because it let out this awful sound, half screech, half growl, but not the kind of noise you'd expect from any living creature. It was unnatural, like something trying to mimic pain. It backed off, circling me. I was bleeding, trying to stand, my flashlight rolling in the dirt somewhere behind me. My shoulder throbbed, and I could feel warm blood soaking through my shirt, but the thing wasn't done with me yet. It was testing me, circling like it knew I couldn't fight back. I could hear something faint in the distance, voices maybe, or was I just imagining it? I stumbled backward, keeping my gun raised, but my vision was blurry, my breathing ragged. I was losing blood fast. Then, out of nowhere, it bolted. Not at me, away, into the woods, gone like it had never been there. I don't know what scared it off, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. I scrambled to my feet and limped back toward the trailhead, leaving the campsite behind. When I finally got back to my car, I collapsed on the ground next to it. I radioed for help, and within an hour, I was in the back of an ambulance, barely able to keep my eyes open. The medics kept asking what happened, but I couldn't explain it. How could I? I just kept saying it was some kind of animal attack. That's all anyone would believe anyway. They found the bodies of the campers a few days later, what was left of them, at least. They never officially said what killed them, but I knew. I never went back to Sutton Creek Forest. I didn't have to. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, lurking, waiting for its next meal. And me, I kept my mouth shut. No one would have believed me if I told them the truth. Somehow, though, I think Sheriff Harlan knew. He never asked me about it after that night. Maybe he'd seen something like it before. Maybe he hadn't. Either way, he let it go, and so did I. The only thing left behind were the scars on my shoulder, and the memory of that thing standing there in the woods watching, calculating. That's all I could tell you, and I'm okay with that. My earliest memory, this is a long one, but it's something that's been on my mind for years. I'm a first-time poster, long-time reader, and it's taken me a while to work up the courage to share this. The title might sound like a typical no-sleep story, and that's exactly what I thought when I first pieced all of this together a couple of months ago. After dealing with the aftermath of a family tragedy, I feel like I'm ready to finally share what happened. I apologize in advance if the formatting is off, as I'm typing this on my phone. So, buckle up, this is going to be a long one. First, I'll start with the nightmare I had as a child. It's a short dream, but one I can still recall with clarity because of how frightening it was. I was about 4 or 5 years old, maybe 6 at the most. My twin brother and I shared a bunk bed in a room at the very farthest end of our house. The nightmare had me lying in bed, looking out the window at a sky that was a deep, ominous red like the sky in the early dawn hours before sunrise, just when the light is barely starting to color the sky. The next and only other thing I remember from this nightmare is a man with wild blue eyes and a bald head staring at me through the window. And then the nightmare ends, but I vividly remember the terror I felt when I woke up screaming. I don't know where my brother was when I woke up screaming, but I remember my mom coming to comfort me, taking me to her bedroom down the hall. I distinctly recall wondering where my dad was at that time, but I don't remember him being there when I woke up. Fast forward to this past May, when my father was in the hospital in Colombia, the country where he lived. My twin brother, our older sister, and I were staying at a hotel about 5 minutes away from the hospital where he was in the ICU. One night, after a long day of being with Dad and the rest of our extended family, my siblings and I returned to the hotel. We sat down to relax and have a couple of beers to unwind after the stressful day. As we chatted, we somehow started talking about nightmares and dreams. I brought up the dream I had all those years ago. Without missing a beat, my sister casually explained that it wasn't just a nightmare, I had actually experienced something real. She remembered everything, including the creepy bald man looking through the window. My sister is 5 years older than my brother and me, so she would have been about 9 or 10 years old at the time of this incident. Her bedroom was adjacent to the room my brother and I shared. While our room faced the neighbor's house and driveway, her room faced our front lawn and the street. Though she didn't give too many details about the days leading up to the event, she mentioned that she had been followed a few times by a bald man driving a truck while she rode her bike home with some friends. The day before this incident was no different, except that this time, the man actually drove past our house. At the time, my brother and I were in a special school about 45 minutes away, dealing with a speech impediment that many twins have. My mom would pick us up after school, leaving my sister alone for only about an hour at a time. That afternoon and evening were pretty normal, according to my sister's memory. My dad came home from his jobs. He worked as a part-time cop and also worked in a local hardware store. We had dinner together, did our homework, and spent time as a family before heading to bed. But around 12 or 1 a.m., the bald man showed up again. This time, he had parked down the street at a small industrial park and walked up to my sister's window. She woke up to the sound of him trying to open it. The window wasn't locked, and she screamed when she saw him. My dad immediately ran in, trying to push the man out or strike him with the nightstick he kept by the door. The man ran off for a moment, but he wasn't gone for long. A short time later, the man came back to try and break into my room. This time, he tried opening my window, but it was locked. My mom had always insisted on keeping it locked because our beds were right against it. My sister recalled that I screamed as loudly as I could, and my mom rushed into our room to grab my brother and me. At the same time, my dad ran out the front door to chase the man, but by then, he had already bolted through our backyard. The backyard backed up to a small rail yard, which was part of the same industrial park down the street. There were dense trees between our neighborhood and the rail yard, making the area very dark at night. My dad didn't want to risk being attacked by the man in such a dark, secluded area, so he went back inside, called the police, and also contacted our elderly neighbor to check on them while my mom took care of us kids. That's all my sister could remember about that night. It was such a long time ago, and neither of us recalled much more after that. The story just kind of ends there. Sadly, my father passed away in the hospital, and we haven't been able to ask him about that night. We haven't thought to ask our mom yet either. but I may bring it up with her soon. For now, to the bald-headed creep who tried to break into our house and do God knows what to my family, let's not meet. Please, let's not. Mr. Touchy-Feely, this isn't exactly the scariest encounter, mainly because of how I reacted. The scary part came afterward, when I learned the truth. I'll admit, I have a bit of a temper, and sometimes it gets the best of me. But I've also been pretty fortunate in that I haven't had too many genuinely frightening experiences in my life. In fact, in my 40 years, I can count the truly scary moments on one hand. This is one of them. At the time, I was commuting to work by bus. On this particular day, I was sitting about halfway down the bus. The bus was about half full, with just one person sitting in most of the front-facing double seats. As we bounced along, hitting every pothole, I was reading a book to pass the time when I felt something touch my hair. At first, I assumed it was just caught on the collar of my coat or the back of the seat. I shook my head to free it and went back to my book. A few moments later, something touched my hair again. I reached back to brush my hair out, thinking it was getting tangled. Then it happened a third time. I turned around, looked behind me, and saw a youngish man in his mid-30s, sporting a messy stubble look. He wore a grubby, wrinkled t-shirt and an equally shabby jacket. He seemed to be looking out the window, so I turned back to my book. I thought nothing of it at first, but then again something touched my hair. This time, I didn't just react, I tensed up, preparing for whatever might come next. And when I felt the touch again, I whirled around. There he was, hand raised, trying to touch my hair. Our eyes met, his startled, mine probably murderous. "Keep your damn hands to yourself," I snarled at him. At this point, you might be thinking I'm exaggerating. This little woman with a round face, looking perpetually worried, snarled. Yep, but to be honest, I wasn't scared, not yet. I was more angry than anything. All I wanted was to read my book and get home. My first instinct was to get mad, not scared. Plus, I wasn't alone. There were other passengers around, so I felt emboldened. I turned back to face forward, expecting that to be the end of it. But it wasn't. A few minutes passed, and then my hair was grabbed and yanked hard. I should have moved to another seat or gone to the bus driver, but I didn't. It had been a long, exhausting day, and I wasn't in the mood to take any shit from anyone. I turned around again, this time, quietly and coldly telling him, "If you touch me again, I will hurt you." Now, for a little background on what came next. My job, both then and now, involves a lot of typing, so much so that I wore the fingerprints off the tips of my fingers at one point. My hands are pretty strong because of this. I never need anyone to open a pickle jar for me. In fact, people come to me to open jars for them. So of course, Mr. Touchy-Feely grabbed my hair again. I turned, grabbed his upraised hand, and squeezed as hard as I could. I kept squeezing. He let out a strangled scream, and I finally released him. The other passengers started shouting, and the bus driver pulled over to the side of the road. I was standing in the aisle, ready to fight if necessary, while Mr. Touchy-Feely sat there, clutching his hand, screeching in pain. The bus driver looked completely confused. This was clearly not the situation he was expecting to deal with. He told me to sit at the front of the bus and ordered Mr. Touchy-Feely to stay where he was. It wasn't long before the police arrived. We were near the junction of 3 different boroughs, so multiple police units showed up. I was taken to one car, and Mr. Touchy-Feely was taken to another. The rest of the passengers were interviewed, and the bus was sent on its way. I never saw Mr. Touchy-Feely again. But here's where things got a bit scarier. The cop who interviewed me told me that the man had been arrested several times before for stalking, and had served to prison sentences for physically and sexually assaulting other women. All of his victims had been complete strangers, and he used the same tactic with each of them touching their hair on public transit. The other women had ignored him, told him off, moved seats, or reported him to the bus driver. I, on the other hand, had broken 3 of his fingers. I'm not saying what I did was the right thing. The officer told me that there was a chance Mr. Touchy-Feely could press charges against me for assault, and despite his criminal record, he could potentially win. I was also informed that I could try pressing charges against him, but that might not go anywhere since all he did was touch my hair. In the end, neither of us pressed charges against each other. A few weeks later, I learned that the district attorney had declined to press charges against me, and in private had said, "You go, girl." The officer also told me that if it had been his daughter, he hoped she would do the same thing I did, and damn the consequences. So, to Mr. Touchy-Feely, let's never meet again for your sake. Story: the echoes in the house. When Sarah bought the old house on Ashwood Lane, she knew it wasn't going to be easy. The house was large, far more than a young woman could possibly need. But it was also beautiful, charming, really, with its faded red brick walls, the ivy climbing up one side, and the Victorian architecture that seemed to whisper of another time. The price was too good to resist. She'd been living in cramped apartments for years, unable to afford a home of her own, and this house had been left to her by an aunt she hardly knew, whose passing had been as quiet as the home itself. At first, the house was perfect. Sarah threw herself into the renovation, painting rooms, fixing pipes, and cleaning out the dusty old furniture that had accumulated over the years. It was hard work, but it was also the first time in her life that she'd had space to think and breathe. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was building something of her own. The town was quiet, too. It was one of those places where people still waved at each other when they passed by on the street, where small talk at the local cafe was an art form, and where people cared enough to ask how your day had been, even if they were just being polite. But Ashwood Lane had a reputation people would smile politely when they talked about it, but there was always something behind their eyes, some unspoken understanding that they didn't share. It was only when Sarah had lived there for a few weeks that she began to notice its strange noises at night, the creak of the floorboards in the hall, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, though there was no one around. At first, she told herself it was just the house settling. After all, it was older than any place she'd ever lived in. It was only natural that a building like that would groan and sigh in the quiet of the night. But the noises didn't stop, they only grew louder. One evening, Sarah was sitting in her small kitchen, a cup of tea in her hand, when she heard it. A soft, steady tapping sound, as though someone was knocking on the door. She froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. But when she looked at the door, there was no one there. She stood up slowly, a chill creeping up her spine, and opened it to find nothing but the quiet, dark street stretching in front of her. No wind, no movement, just silence. She laughed it off. Perhaps she was just imagining things. It had been a long day. But the next night, the tapping came again. This time, it was louder, closer, and then it was joined by something else, a low, muffled whispering. Just beneath the sound of the tapping, Sarah's heart began to race. She stood in the doorway, staring out into the empty street. "Hello," she called, her voice shaky, but no response came. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun. And just as she was about to close the door, a shadow darted past the edge of the porch, quick as a flash. It was at that moment she realized that something wasn't right. That was when the unease began to settle deep within her chest. She couldn't bring herself to leave, though. She had nowhere else to go, and the house had already become a part of her. She couldn't walk away from it. Instead, she tried to ignore the feeling that something was watching her, lurking just beyond the corners of her vision. But the house continued to give her reasons to doubt her own sanity. The whispering returned, but this time, it was inside. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, and at night, when Sarah lay in bed, the tapping would come again, not on the door, but on the floor beneath her. A rhythmic thud, like someone was walking down the hall, dragging their feet. The footsteps stopped at her bedroom door. She decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, Sarah ventured into the hallway one night, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She moved slowly, scanning the walls for any sign of movement, her heart pounding. She reached the end of the hall and stopped. There was nothing there. But the tapping came again, closer now, as though someone was right behind her. Sarah spun around, her pulse racing, but there was no one there. The hallway stretched behind her, empty and dark, but the sound of footsteps continued to echo in her ears. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hall, a door she had never noticed before was slightly ajar. It wasn't the door to the attic or the closet, it was a small, forgotten room she'd never entered. It had always been closed off, but now the door was open. The whispering grew louder, and Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to walk toward it. She couldn't explain why, but something inside her was pulling her toward that door. With trembling hands, she stepped forward and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, barely more than a closet. There were no windows, no furniture, only bare, cold walls. But in the center of the room, on the floor, was a small, old-fashioned rug. The rug seemed out of place, as if it had been placed there on purpose, but Sarah didn't understand why. Her eyes were drawn to the edges of the rug, where a faint pattern was visible. She bent down to look closer, and that's when she saw it, a small, faded symbol, like a sigil etched into the wood of the floor beneath the rug. The pattern was circular, with strange markings she didn't recognize. As her fingers traced the lines of the symbol, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the air grew thick and heavy. The whispering grew louder, and Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine. The door slammed shut behind her. Trapped in the room, she tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to be closing in on her, the walls pressing in, the air thick with the stench of decay. The whispering had turned into a low growl, and now it seemed as though the walls themselves were speaking. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and the world around her went black. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying on the floor in her bedroom, gasping for air. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to peek through the window. The room was silent, still, like nothing had happened. But Sarah knew. She knew that something was different. Something had changed. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. The house had always been old, but now it felt alive. The whispers were no longer just noises in the dark, they were voices. Voices that spoke to her from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. She couldn't escape them, and now they wanted something from her. It wasn't long before Sarah found herself returning to that room. The door was still there, just as it had been before. But this time, it didn't open on its own. She had to force it. Inside, the room seemed different, darker, colder, as though the air itself was suffocating her. And the rug was still there, its edges curled, the sigil beneath it glowing faintly. Sarah didn't know why she was doing this. It felt like something was controlling her, guiding her. She bent down and grabbed the edges of the rug, pulling it back. But this time, the symbol wasn't just a mark, it was a doorway. A crack split the floor, and from the depths of the earth, something reached up toward her. The walls groaned, the floor trembled, and the house seemed to roar with hunger. And then, from the darkness, the whispering stopped. A single word echoed through the air, "Run." But it was too late. She was already caught. A Friday night delivery gone wrong. It was a regular Friday night, and I was out doing DoorDash to earn extra cash while juggling college life. The night started strong, with back-to-back orders during the dinner rush, but things slowed down significantly afterward. Most of the orders that came through were either too far or paid too little to be worth it. After about an hour of aimless driving, I got a notification for an order that was somewhat far, 8 miles away, but paid decently enough. I accepted it, picked up the food, and started driving. The app estimated it would take about 30 minutes, the longest delivery I'd ever done. The drive started like any other, with houses and buildings gradually thinning out as I moved away from the campus area. By the 20-minute mark, I was driving through stretches of empty farmland with few houses scattered far apart. The silence and isolation of the road felt unsettling, but I pressed on, eager to complete the order. When I finally arrived, I saw a narrow dirt driveway leading through a field to a small house in the distance. The eerie quiet made me uneasy, and as I drove closer, The only sound was the crunch of my car tires on the dirt. I parked in front of the house, leaving the engine running. The house looked dark and dilapidated, with only a porch light illuminating the overgrown grass and decaying wood. Bag in hand, I approached the door, knocked, and waited. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, but still no answer. Standing on the porch, I began to notice just how rundown the house was. There were no visible lights inside, and the windows were grimy and cracked. Something about the situation felt off. The only reason I didn't leave immediately was the porch light. It suggested someone might actually be home. Then, I looked closer and noticed the light fixture was solar-powered. It didn't require anyone to be there to turn it on. As the realization hit me, a rumbling sound broke the silence behind me. I turned around to see a car driving up the dirt path toward my parked vehicle. Its headlights cut through the darkness, and as it stopped just behind my car, a man stepped out. "Is this your order?" I called from the porch, trying to sound confident despite my growing unease. The man didn't respond. He just stood by his car, staring at me without moving. My heart raced. The silence of the night made the situation feel even more sinister. I was alone in the middle of a field, caught between an empty house and a stranger who wasn't saying a word. Instinct took over. I dropped the food and bolted off the porch, running behind the house and into the tall grass. As I sprinted, I glanced back and saw the man following me. The further I ran, the taller and denser the grass became, eventually obscuring everything around me. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath and remain quiet. I couldn't hear him anymore, and hoped the grass had hidden me well enough. After what felt like an eternity, I reached another property and found a road where I could finally call for help. The police arrived and escorted me back to my car, but by then, the man was gone. Strangely, my car and the bag of food on the porch were untouched. It was clear the man's intentions weren't robbery, which made the situation all the more terrifying. To this day, I have no idea why he was in my house or what he wanted, and that uncertainty still haunts me. Story 1. A late night breakdown. I was leaving work late due to a recent security issue at my company that had everyone working overtime. Normally, I'd take the train, but knowing I'd be out past its running hours, I drove instead. The drive home was nearly an hour, and as I left the city, I noticed my gas gauge was almost empty. I didn't remember it being this low earlier, but I assumed I'd missed it in my exhaustion. I planned to fill up at a gas station near my house, but 10 minutes later, my dashboard flashed a warning that my fuel was critically low. The needle had dropped far faster than it should have, and soon after, my car started sputtering before the engine cut out entirely. Frustrated and confused, I pulled over and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment to investigate. It only took a few seconds to find the problem. Gas was leaking from my tank. I had no idea how this could have happened, as everything seemed fine earlier. Before I could process it, a truck pulled up behind me. Its headlights were off, and it parked quickly and decisively. I stood up, aiming my flashlight at the windshield, where I saw a couple of figures moving inside. "I'm okay, don't need any help," I called out, but they didn't respond. Instead, one of the truck's doors opened and a man stepped out. "Need a ride?" he asked, smirking as he approached. Something about his tone made my skin crawl. I declined firmly and quickly got back into my car, locking the doors. The man stood outside my window for what felt like an eternity, staring at me silently. I called the police, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. Eventually, he walked back to the truck, got in, and drove off slowly. As he passed, I glanced at his back seat and froze. Someone was pressed against the window, wide-eyed and motionless. It didn't look like they were there willingly. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They found that my gas tank had been intentionally punctured, likely by someone who'd followed me, hoping I'd accept their help. Unfortunately, the truck's license plate was missing, and the man was never found. To this day, I wonder about the person in the back seat and what might have happened if I hadn't locked my doors. Story 1. The night at the pizza shop. My name is Leo, and I work at a pizza shop in a small town. I don't handle deliveries, but do everything else inside, from making pizzas to organizing stations, cleaning, and handling closing tasks. My interaction with customers is usually limited since we have high school employees taking orders until 11 p.m. on weekdays. After that, the shop closes at 12:30 a.m., leaving me responsible for any remaining orders or walk-ins. It was a typical Monday shift. Everything ran smoothly, and my co-worker left at 11 p.m., leaving me alone to close up. The night was slow, so I started cleaning about 30 minutes before closing. Then, a call came in. Hoping it wasn't a last-minute order, I answered with the usual greeting, but after a brief pause, the caller hung up. Frustrated, I dismissed it as a prank. Not even 30 seconds later, I heard the bell at the front door. Annoyed, I set my cleaning tools aside and walked to the counter. A man was standing there, wearing a heavy coat and a black beanie. His disheveled appearance put me on edge. Dark circles under wide-open eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. "How can I help you?" I asked, keeping my distance. He replied, "I'd like to place an order right now," but his tone was unsettling. As he struggled to respond to my follow-up, I noticed his hand partially hidden in his coat pocket. My stomach dropped. He was holding a kitchen knife, the blade partly visible. Just as panic set in, the sound of the door opening startled both of us. Another customer entered, immediately sensing the tension. The man at the counter froze, then walked past the newcomer and out the door. I quickly called 911, explaining what happened. The other customer and I watched as the man drove off in his car. Later, I realized he might have watched the shop from outside, waiting for me to answer the phone and confirm I was alone. If not for the random customer's arrival, I'm not sure what would have happened. Thankfully, I haven't seen him since, and I hope it stays that way. Story: a stormy night in the basement. I was 17, living in my parents' basement, which was more like an in-law suite than a typical unfinished space. My parents traveled often for work, so I was usually alone during their trips. On this particular Saturday, I had no school or plans, but a storm was rolling in later that day. Before it hit, I took my parents' car to the store to stock up on food. As I drove back, the storm arrived. Visibility was poor, even with the wipers on full speed. I finally reached home, hurried inside, and dried off. After turning on the oven to make dinner, I heard a noise from the basement. It sounded like something falling over, perhaps a box. My first thought was a leak or a flood, so I went to check. I opened the basement door, turned on the light, and walked down the stairs. Everything seemed fine at first. The main area where I had a small couch and TV looked untouched. Then I checked the storage room, the only unfinished part of the basement. Initially, everything appeared normal. But as I looked closer, I saw one of the boxes at the top of a stack had been opened. Its contents, my parents' old trophies, were scattered and broken, as if someone had hastily tossed them back in. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, the storm's noise masking any potential sounds. Just as I started backing away, another box in the corner fell. Behind it, a man suddenly lunged at me. Terrified, I sprinted up the stairs, hearing his footsteps close behind. On the last step, I tripped and fell, fearing the worst. But when I turned around, the man reached the top of the stairs, saw me, and bolted out the front door. I locked the door and called the cops. They found an unlocked window where he'd entered, but couldn't determine his motive. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, here to guide you today. Many of you use these videos to relax or drift off to sleep, so before we begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Now, settle in, get comfy, and let's begin. Mirror and corridor story. The first night in that old house stands vivid in my mind. My breath felt unnaturally loud against the silence. Now, as I lie awake in the attic's dim light, my mouth is dry, and the hairs on my arms prickle as though charged with static. Clenching a flashlight between my teeth, I dig through a dusty crate filled with newspapers and rusted nails. The air is thick with the smell of aged wood and mold. I've been here only a few days after leaving my noisy highway-side apartment, but something about this house gnaws at me, a subtle pressure at the back of my mind, whispering I shouldn't have come. When I first saw the house, the realtor brushed aside my questions. Yes, it was old. Yes, the previous owner had disappeared or died. Details were vague. The price was good, and I needed a fresh start. But I should have trusted my instincts when I saw the peeling wallpaper on the stairwell and the crooked chandelier in the living room. The place felt hollow, like a shell. Now, here I am, trying to ignore the sheet-draped object in the attic corner, a tall, human height shape covered in a gray, dust-stained cloth. My eyes keep drifting toward it. Earlier that day, I'd noticed the large object, but dismissed it, too busy setting up my bed downstairs and unpacking a few essentials. But tonight, something woke me, a soft creak directly above my bedroom. My heart pounded as I climbed the attic stairs, determined to find a logical explanation, perhaps a loose beam or a draft. Yet when I opened the attic door, the air felt heavier, thicker, as though the room itself was alive and breathing. My flashlight's beam skimmed over wooden beams and forgotten furniture, and then I heard it again, a faint, drawn-out creak. It was too deliberate to be the house settling. It sounded like a whisper, beckoning me closer. I swallowed hard, my palms damp as my legs stiffened. The sheet-covered object stood in the corner, half hidden behind stacked chairs. Ignoring it became impossible. Step by step, I approached, reaching out to the dusty cloth. As I pulled it free, a cloud of particles erupted into the air, making me cough. Beneath it was a tall mirror with a carved wooden frame, its surface slightly warped and cracked in one corner. I angled my flashlight, peering into my reflection, pale, gaunt, my eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But behind my reflection, there was something else, a shape. At first, I thought it was a smudge or stain on the glass, but no, it was a figure standing behind me, indistinct, its features shrouded. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over hollow eyes. My breath hitched. Whipping around, I shined the flashlight into the room, finding only empty chairs and a trunk. Turning back to the mirror, the figure remained, hovering over my shoulder as though it hadn't moved at all. My throat tightened, and my hand trembled as I moved the flashlight side to side, testing for tricks of light. But the figure didn't waver. I couldn't make out its face, yet I felt it smiling or wanting to. Panicked, I grabbed the sheet and flung it back over the mirror, stumbling toward the attic door. The floorboards groaned under my hurried steps. Back in my room downstairs, I lay awake on the mattress, breathing shallowly. My eyes refused to close, haunted by the image of the figure behind me. The silence in the house was thicker now, pressing into my ears like an unseen weight. I could hear my heart pounding, each beat blurring my vision. I tried to speak, to demand who or what they were, but my throat tightened, and all that escaped was a cough that echoed unnaturally in the space. The reflection moved again, lifting its hand a split second after mine, as if struggling to mimic my motion. I reached toward the mirror, my fingers trembling, intending to test if the surface was solid. But before I touched it, the glass rippled like disturbed water under shifting light. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my hand back, my veins electrified by fear. There was something there, not just in the mirror, but behind it. I could feel its gaze, feeding on the anxiety twisting my muscles. The corridor seemed to close in around me, its walls constricting. My breaths grew shallow and erratic. What would happen if I fainted? Would I wake up in another dimension, surrounded by the distorted shapes I feared? Staggering back, I tripped over a rug and nearly dropped the flashlight. The whispers surged into a chaotic crescendo, and the faces of the sculptures twisted further, their mouths stretching wide in silent screams. I bolted, crouched low as my shoulders scraped against the shelves, scattering grimoires to the floor. I didn't stop until I had climbed the stairs and burst into the main store. There I crouched behind a stack of dusty chairs, struggling to catch my breath as sweat glued my clothes to my skin. I don't know how long I stayed there, heart racing and eyes locked on the floorboards. Eventually, I locked the basement door and retreated to my room upstairs. For days, I couldn't eat. Food tasted like ash. My reflection in the bedroom mirror looked wrong, my eyes were sunken, and my skin had a dark, hollow quality. I jumped at every sound, certain something had followed me. Even the store above the basement felt still, as if the antiques themselves were holding their breath. Once, in a half-sleep, I thought I saw something in the corner of my mirror, a faint outline of the sculptures, shaking their heads in quiet disapproval. When I turned on the light, the shape vanished, but the hammering of my heart didn't stop. Today, I forced myself to check the basement door. It was still locked, but I heard whispers through the wood, scratching at the edges of my mind. I know the corridor remains, unchanged yet shifting in some way I can't fully grasp. If I were to open that door, I'd see the sculptures again, their faces rearranged, their judgment sharper. And the mirror would still be there, waiting, a thin barrier between two worlds. Whatever lurks behind it hasn't stopped watching, waiting for its moment. Its hunger grows, and I don't know how much longer I can resist. Even now, standing upstairs, I catch a faint flicker in the store's glass cabinets. My reflection is just slightly delayed, and my eyes seem darker than they should be. I can taste the gritty dust in the air, like crushed glass on my tongue. In my final glance, I see something in the glass shapes hovering just behind me. This isn't over. It's only waiting. That night stands clear in my memory, because it was the first time I felt truly trapped in my own home.